Hole for a Heart by Robert Alessar. Read by the author. Copyright 2018 by Robert Alessar. All rights reserved. Any reproduction of this work by any means without the express written consent of the author and publisher is strictly prohibited. For Jacob and Kira. Jonathan Lama drove west along Interstate 80 on a warm, late spring day headed for Chicago. His journey was at least partly an excuse to test the recently purchased '97 Mustang convertible he drove. He was not a true car aficionado, but he liked the Mustang, and he had a good friend, Rob Gardner, who was a mechanic and lived near him. When John had told Rob he was looking for a second car and had found the Mustang for a very good price, Rob had all but offered to go in halfsies just to have the chance to work on and restore it. Rob plied his trade only part-time, and under the table, since a severe back injury had left him both eligible for disability benefits and honestly unable to work a full schedule. He was, however, good at what he did, and after much effort and a fair amount of additional expense, he pronounced the car ready for long-distance travel. All the remaining work was cosmetic. So far, John had no complaints about his friend's efforts. He'd previously only driven the Mustang around central New Jersey, where he lived. In the beginning, it had ridden rough, and the speedometer had malfunctioned, making John nervous every time he took it out, though it had been easy enough to match the speed of traffic. Now the speedometer had been replaced and checked and was working as it should. The engine ran powerfully on all 8 cylinders, and John could barely tell that he wasn't driving a brand-new car, at least based on those criteria. The interior still needed a lot of work, and the car's paint was noticeably faded, but John had never disagreed with Rob in prioritizing functional issues. Once the car was ready for a real journey, John had taken some time off to go on a trip. He did contract IT work for several companies throughout New Jersey, and his schedule was flexible. Even better at his job than Rob was at his, John never lacked employment when he wanted it. His skills were in high demand despite the large number of competing IT professionals in the marketplace. John was simply the best, so he could choose his job to suit his preferences. He'd decided to take his newish Mustang out to Chicago for a few days. He'd gone to college there as an undergrad, and he loved the city pretty much any time it wasn't winter, which he had to admit narrowed things down somewhat. Still, during the late spring, John had found few places more beautiful than the Windy City. He couldn't wait to drive up Lakeshore Drive, to pass the museums, to go downtown. He wanted finally to look at that reflective bean-shaped sculpture in Millennium Park, which he'd never bothered to visit when he'd lived in the city. He wanted to go northwest and see if Long Grove still existed. If it did, he would gorge himself there on candy, donuts, and crafts, and would bring home some of the fantastic locally made jelly and jam he'd found there. As a surface to which to apply that jelly and jam, there were few things better than the locally made scones. These had been even better than the donuts. Also, John wasn't sure if it was out of season to get cider, but if it wasn't, he was going to, by God, get some. Just thinking about it made him smile. He knew, though, that he'd have to be on his guard against wistfulness when he was in Chicago. That was where he'd had his only long-term relationship, and where he'd been left by the love of his life. They'd been together for almost 3 years, and had even shared an apartment during senior year. John had needed to hide that fact from his own parents, but hers, oddly, had never seemed bothered. Allison Cheney, a name John usually avoided thinking, was as ambitious as she was bright and beautiful. She wanted much from life, and had seen in John someone with the potential to become one of the software tycoons who had sprung up like weeds all over America in the preceding few decades. In this she was probably right. John recognized the fact without fear of egotism. He was exceptional both at programming and at the hardware side of the IT industry, and at some level he truly loved it. Allison had seen in him the soul and capabilities of a Michelangelo in his field, and though that was perhaps taking things a bit far, John knew he could have been extraordinarily successful. This was confirmed by the fact that he made more money working 10 hours a week on contracts than 80% of New Jersey citizens did working full-time. Even though John usually took longer than he honestly needed for most jobs, he was still the most sought-after contractor in Central Jersey, according to those who sought him. Yet John had never desired the life of a Gates, a Jobs, or a Zuckerberg, nor that of the seemingly endless second-tier heroes of the industry. It was simply too stressful, and the rewards were not worth the cost. He had but one life. He didn't want to squander it playing games of one-upmanship against other computer demigods for the dubious rewards of money, lots of it to be fair, and recognition, much less valuable and as ephemeral as the latest iPhone version. If he was a Michelangelo, then he was one who was satisfied to be paid very well to do the occasional strikingly good wedding portrait or decorative mural. Unfortunately, that had been unacceptable to Allison. John had never been certain if it was the possible wealth and fame lost, or the fact that his ability would never be brought into the world in its fullest capacity that had driven her most to distraction. He suspected the latter. His personal lack of ambition, and the implicit near-nihilism that underlay it, had been the source of almost all of their fights, which had grown in frequency as graduation had approached. Allison had wanted John either to go into a respected graduate program doing serious research and development, or to seek out a position in a major corporation like Apple or Google or Microsoft. John, however, had taken a job at a company near his parents' home in New Jersey. It was not a bad job, but it had been nowhere near as good as he could have had. He had simply been too disheartened by the amount of work, the potential strain, and the inescapable fact that no one could be the unrivaled best in the computer industry, no matter how hard one tried or how gifted one was. It was easier, in some ways better, to be mediocre than to be almost the best. Ultimately, Allison had left him. John had been heartbroken, but he'd recovered. He never expected anything special from life, and thus was never disappointed, or so he told himself. Perhaps contradicting that claim, though, he still had to force himself not to think about Allison, not to imagine the life they might have had together. By now she was, no doubt, married to some mover and shaker, or, more likely, was a mover and shaker herself, possibly still in Chicago. John had dated a few women since Allison, but none for longer than 6 months. He'd never come close to any stronger commitment. In his devastating young heartbreak, he seemed to have lost the capacity to achieve, or even to want, a deep relationship. He shook his head, trying to drive his maudlin thoughts away. Why was he thinking about Allison after so long? He'd put her out of his mind for ages and was satisfied to have done so. He had, of course, been aware that traveling to Chicago might trigger the odd memory here and there. He hadn't, however, expected the reminiscences to begin on a stretch of interstate in western central Pennsylvania, a region through which he didn't think he'd ever driven with Allison. The sky matched his abrupt gloominess. The trip had been bright and clear thus far, but now clouds had gathered, and one seemed to have shaded the sun as if to add atmosphere to John's reminiscences. He forced himself to focus anew on his surroundings. The low, ancient mountains of eastern Pennsylvania had not yet given way entirely to the flat, level ground at the western end of the state, but they had been attenuated greatly, and John now drove through a region of gently rolling hills, through forest and farmland with many miles between major cities. It was a beautiful landscape in the late spring. The trees bore full foliage, the fields had been sown and were beginning to grow, and John had no doubt that healthy wildlife populated the extensive woodlands. It should have been impossible to be anything but cheerful looking at such beauty, but John felt morose. His reminiscences, he refused to acknowledge them as regrets, had dampened his spirits. As his car came to the top of a gentle rise, higher than most of its brethren, John caught sight of something curious ahead. There was a highway exit just before the next hill, and, as with many, a gas station was visible near the turnoff. At the top of that rise, just before it dropped off into the cut that had made way for the interstate, was a great, spreading, towering tree. It looked like a pecan tree to John, but he wasn't sure they grew in Pennsylvania. He'd always loved those trees. He'd seen many when he'd visited his relatives in the South as a child, though he never could stomach the nuts. He'd thought they were a southern-only growth, but maybe there were strains that grew farther north. Or perhaps this tree merely reminded him of the beautiful, sprawling pecans he'd seen as a child. In any case, it was not the tree that pulled John's focus, but what stood under it, a few yards from the trunk, an entirely different kind of planting than that great natural growth. In the tree's shadow stood what looked for all the world like a scarecrow. John couldn't make out any details, but it seemed a typical fixture of at least storybook cornfields, a stuffed human shape raised on a piece of wood like a cheap country crucifix. The presence of this entirely typical prop in an atypical location had drawn John's attention, for there were no fields within a stone's throw of the figure, nothing for it to protect from the depredations of corvids. John had always thought crows were too smart to fall for such transparent decoys anyway, but still, one would think that a scarecrow belonged amidst planted crops. The nearest sown field to the tree and its attendant was easily at least 100 yards away, well behind the gas station. Of course, another possible use for a scarecrow, particularly one under a tree, was as a Halloween decoration. It was 1,000 years till autumn, but John supposed someone might have put the thing up the previous October and decided simply to leave it, since it would eventually become appropriate again. John glanced at his gas gauge as he rolled down the current hill and approached the next one. The tank was almost half full, so he didn't really need to stop. The Mustang was not easy on fuel. It wouldn't hurt to top it off. Also, the pack of Newports on the passenger seat was less than quarter full and could use replacing. Poor Rob had been distressed to realize that John meant to smoke in the Mustang. John had pointed out that it didn't change the car's appearance at all, but Rob had insisted that it harmed the spirit of the revived vehicle. He'd even ruefully remarked that John was going to give the car cancer. This had caused John to laugh uproariously, partly from the absurdity of the claim and also in recognition of the fact that Rob knew such a warning was useless against John himself. He often said that he knew smoking was shortening his life, but that it was his own way of throwing scraps of meat to his death wish. This was, he said, the only way to keep it from becoming ravenous and predatory, swallowing him whole. He always made such statements in jocular tones, but there was more than a little truth to them. Smirking at the memory of Rob's objection, John decided to stop at the gas station, fill his tank, get new cigarettes, and perhaps get a bite to eat if the place had any snacks worth the trouble. He would also, just maybe, get a better look at the unusually placed scarecrow. As he pulled into the exit lane, John imagined the Mustang complaining about having to slow down from the highway speeds, but it did as commanded. He reached the end of the exit, came to a slightly rolling stop, and turned right. The gas station he had seen was now on his left, a short distance ahead. Slightly nearer, but farther back from the road, were the hill, the great tree, and the smaller, darker figure. John was more certain now that the tree really was Pecan, but he found that he could not yet make out the scarecrow well, his view of it being partly obscured by the tree trunk. Slightly miffed, he turned his attention back to the gas station. It had seen better days, but was clearly open. A tall sit-go sign, below which were posted the gas prices, revealed what breed of station it was, but there was no other more personal indicator, no Joe's service station or similar, anywhere in evidence. The building near the pumps didn't look big enough to contain an eatery, but it might at least have a selection of chips and soda. John would settle for that, or for its lack. He supposed he could even settle for not getting cigarettes if they didn't have them. He just wanted gas and to ask about the scarecrow. He wondered why the thing intrigued him so, but he didn't give the question much thought. Indulging in his idle curiosity was a welcome diversion from his preceding morose thoughts about a subject he wanted to avoid. He pulled into the gas station and drew up to the nearest pump. His was the only vehicle getting gas, but a truck was parked beside the building to the right, probably belonging to an attendant or perhaps to the owner. The lack of customers didn't surprise John. Most drivers on the interstate used the big rest-stop-style gas stations, as John did himself when there were no mysterious effigies to investigate. Stopping the car, John stepped out, but before moving toward the station he gazed in the direction of the tree. It was perhaps half a football field away, and though the scarecrow was in its shadow, he could make out more details now. It was fully man-sized, with outstretched crucified arms typical of such figures. The head was neither made of, nor made to look like, a jack-o'-lantern, but instead appeared to be normal human head-shaped and sized, though its sagging nature led him to think it had been fashioned from a sack, perhaps a pillowcase. He could make nothing out about the design of the face. Unlike many scarecrows John had seen, and he only just now realized that he had seen many, at least in pictures, this one bore not just 2 arms, but 2 legs, as well as what appeared to be hands and feet, no doubt fashioned from gloves and boots. His clothes were nondescript, with no details discernible from a distance. Looking at it, John felt a mild chill. This was perhaps mainly due to the cloud cover that had taken away some of the sunny warmth that had previously dominated his trip, but it was also caused by the sense that the scarecrow was out of place and time. Why would someone put such a figure under a tree near the highway? Why would they leave it there long after Halloween or long before? It looked well cared for. It was quite upright, and its outlines were firm and recognizable. John would have thought that, if it were just some prop left behind from last October, the rigors of a Pennsylvania winter should have beaten it down some. Shaking his head and shrugging, John turned from the hill. He glanced at the pumps and saw to his surprise that they bore no slot for a credit card. How old was this gas station? He couldn't recall the last time he'd been to one where he couldn't pay at the pump. That hardly mattered, though. He planned to go inside to buy cigarettes and to get some snacks anyway. Looking idly up the road onto which he had turned, John saw a few widely separated buildings lining it. They looked like commercial structures, long past their heyday, and John wondered if any were abandoned. A few cars and trucks were parked here and there, but John saw no living soul. If not for the steady sound of traffic on I-80, he might have thought the whole region was deserted. Farther down the road, almost beyond the range of his sight, he made out what might be the spire of a small church. Perhaps a town lay in that direction. Shrugging, John turned and strolled casually toward the gas station door. Its plexiglass panel hadn't been cleaned in some time and was smudged and hazy. An old-fashioned bell jingled as John opened it and stepped inside. The interior was about what John had expected, a counter with a cash register and with a display of cigarettes and other tobacco products above and behind it. To the right were a few racks of chips and candy, beyond which was a forlorn assortment of refrigerated cabinets containing mostly Coke and Pepsi products. John was amused and strangely pleased to see no Monster, Red Bull, or other energy drinks. A door to the rear of the product section opened into what looked to be the restroom and probably a storage and office area. To John's left, a shelf on the wall bore 2 coffee pots, accompanied by paper cups, creamer, and sweeteners, as well as a microwave and a small selection of instant ramen soups. To the rear was a water tap. Behind the counter slouched a young man wearing a Pittsburgh Steelers ball cap, an unmarked but faded gray t-shirt, and a forlorn attempt at a goatee. He looked mildly surprised by John's presence, but became quickly alert and attentive, belying what John might have expected was a diffident attitude. "Afternoon," the young man said. "Afternoon," John replied with a smile, pleased by the semi-formal greeting. "How's business today?" The young man looked surprised by the question, and he seemed to give it honest thought before shrugging and saying, "About like normal, I guess. It's never all that busy, but it's steady. There's always traffic off I-80. "Yeah, I guess so," John said, having reached the counter while the young man spoke. "And you guys have some pretty interesting advertising." Now the young man looked deeply puzzled, and John wondered whether he might be just a little on the slow side. "You mean the sign?" he asked, obviously referring, with understandable confusion, to the towering but weathered Citgo logo outside. John, disliking himself for the urge to chuckle, said, No, I mean the big tree with the scarecrow under it. That's what caught my eye." The boy's expression looked less puzzled now, but also less interested, giving John the impression that the subject troubled him. "Oh, that," he said. "Yeah, well, I guess that does get some attention." Then, becoming businesslike, he asked, "Did you want some gas?" Surprised in turn, though he supposed he shouldn't be, John said, "Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, I'd like to fill it up on that tank there." He looked over his shoulder toward his car, a bit bemused that he had forgotten to look for the pump number. The young man, however, could not help but see up to which pump John had pulled. He cocked his head as though checking to be sure and said, "Pump number 3. "Number 3, right," John replied, as though he had known but forgotten. "Fill her up on number 3, and a pack of Newport 100s, menthol." The young man nodded, reached up to pull out the requested cigarettes, then typed their price into the cash register to John's sincere surprise. It seemed that this place didn't have a laser scanner. It didn't have pay at the pump, and it didn't have a laser scanner. Astounding. "Will that be it?" the young man, whom John had to struggle to avoid thinking of as a boy, asked. Well, I was going to grab some chips or something. Would it be okay if I do that after I pump my gas?" "Sure," the clerk replied, clearly wondering why John felt that he needed to ask. "Okay," John said. He pulled out his wallet, retrieved his visa from its assigned slot, and handed it to the clerk. "There you go." He half expected that, if he had not proffered the card, the boy would have let him have the cigarettes and pump the gas before even asking for payment. The clerk took the card, but even as he turned to activate the gas pump, he said, "I won't run this till you have everything together. No sense doing 2 charges, right?" "Right," John agreed, though he thought the young man, was a bit too trusting. John could have given him a bogus card and driven off immediately after pumping the gas. Perhaps in this he was betraying his own cynical attitude. It wasn't that he thought people were particularly bad, just that they tended to be parochial and foolish, with a self-interest bordering on solipsism. Even Allison, surely one of John's favorite people ever, had been terribly focused on her ambition and on material success in the eyes of others. Of course, at least part of her motive had been the desire to see John achieve the greatness of which she believed he was capable, but she had wanted that for her, not for him. Perhaps he should have just gone with it. He could have. If he had dedicated himself to living up to her dreams, he could have achieved amazing feats, of that he had little doubt. Maybe nothing truly earth-shaking, but still, he could have been extremely successful. Would that have been so bad? It wouldn't have been terrible, he supposed, but he would have been living his life to the shape of someone else's dreams rather than his own. And would that have been so bad? Who could answer such a question? John forced the thoughts from his mind, angry that, once again, he had thought of Allison, felt the ache of her absence, when he had succeeded at shutting down those emotions for so long. He'd had no idea that a trip to Chicago could be so triggering, even when he was less than halfway to his destination. He needed to get a handle on himself. "You okay?" the young man asked, causing John to give a tiny start. The clerk regarded him with mild, puzzled curiosity, but he didn't seem truly worried. "You were just staring off into space there for a little." John blinked and shook his head, giving a brief, self-deprecating laugh as he did. "Yeah, I guess I was. Just spacing out, I guess." The young man smiled and nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I know how it is. I do that a lot." "I bet you do," John thought, immediately berating himself for his condescension. He smiled again and said, "Well, I'll be right back." The clerk nodded without another word, and John walked out through the smudgy faux-glass door. As he approached his car, he confirmed that, yes indeed, he was parked at pump number 3. He opened the gas flap, unscrewed the tank lid, then grabbed the pump handle and selected the highest octane gas before putting the nozzle into the tank and locking it into the on position. While the gas flowed, John turned to look at the giant pecan tree. He was now all but certain that it was indeed a pecan, surprising though that was. Annoyingly, that fact too made him think of Allison. He'd told her often about the trees he'd loved in his childhood, and she'd said that they should make a trip south together some day to visit the sites of his happy memories. That had never happened, though, and a regretful pang struck John's chest at the thought. Angry at the pang as much as at his lack of control of his own thoughts, John tore his gaze from the tree and focused instead on the much smaller figure beside it. The cloud cover and the shadows were as deep as before, but John thought he could make out more of the thing's features now. A bit atypically, no hat adorned it. Looking at the bag head of the scarecrow, John decided that it probably wasn't a pillowcase after all. More likely, based on the color and the way its folds lay, it was an old-fashioned burlap sack. He thought that he could just make out the grainy texture of the cloth. He also thought he could make out some semblance of decorative facial features, perhaps the image of an eye, perhaps more. It was angled slightly in his direction, facing across the fields and woods behind and beyond the gas station, so its head was in partial profile to John. The eye looked as if it had been designed to appear stitched shut with great twine stitches. It had, John thought, a similarly stitched mouth, curved downward in an expression of sadness or disgust. It was not a pleasant face, and certainly would have done a fair job of frightening Halloween revelers. It made John uncomfortable even now. But what good could it do up there, facing away from the road, nowhere near any houses? Who would be able to appreciate its macabre visage? The body was, as John had already seen, an excellent simulation. Its proportions were all correct. Even the way its arms bent slightly in the middle seemed accurately to evoke elbow joints. The knees and ankles, too, hung in a disturbingly realistic manner. John had the morbid thought that perhaps this scarecrow had been fashioned from the body of an actual man. That was ridiculous, of course. It would be extraordinarily ballsy to prop a human corpse beside the interstate. Still, it did look real. A gust of wind came from the west, revealing an aspect of the figure that departed from the realism of the rest. That wind pressed the workshirt of the scarecrow against its torso, disclosing a strange concavity, as though whoever had made it had forgotten to stuff the chest all the way. Or perhaps some stuffing had fallen out and hadn't been replaced. Given the otherwise realistic character of the thing and the brooding, unhappy, sewn-up face, the incongruity was disquieting. John gave a brief, slightly affected shiver and half wished that he didn't have such good distant vision. A sudden click made him jump in place, and he turned his head, realizing that his gas tank was full much more quickly than he'd expected it to be. He reminded himself that he'd stopped before it was necessary and smiled at his own startlement. If he wasn't talking himself into unwelcome reminiscences or giving himself the creeps over a scarecrow below a tree, he was losing track of simple details that he normally would have kept in the front of his mind. Apparently, highway hypnosis was already taking its toll. He wondered if he was going to need to stop at a motel at some point instead of driving straight through to Chicago, as had been his plan. He supposed that would be fine. He wasn't a college student anymore, and he had nothing to prove. It was certainly not worth endangering the other drivers on the road just so that he could get to his destination in one day. He topped the tank off with a quick final squeeze of the pump, which he then returned to its place before resealing the tank and closing the flap. He turned back to the gas station and strolled inside. The young man waved and gave a tiny smile, asking, "All set?" "Yep," John replied. "Just gonna get those snacks and I'll be done." "Good deal," the clerk replied, and John veered toward the chip and candy racks. The selection of potato chips and related junk food was impressively complete despite its modest size. Most of the fundamental Frito-Lay line was on display, as well as its main competitors. At least 5 different flavors of Pringles were available, and all 3 potencies of Tostitos brand salsa were present, as were the corn chips themselves. John opted for the slightly conservative, grabbing a mid-sized bag of plain Ruffles, then went around to the candy display, quickly choosing a Baby Ruth, easily his favorite candy bar, before taking a quick look for more proteinaceous food. All he found were a few bags of beef jerky, but those were always far too expensive for what they contained. Deciding that his current choices were good enough, John made a quick trip to the refrigerators, considered a Dr. Pepper, then decided on a 16-ounce can of Coke. Armed with this small but impressive selection of unhealthy foodstuffs, he turned toward the cash register. The pack of Newports lay on the counter, and the young man seemed already to have rung up John's gas. As John approached, the clerk eyed his purchases and began to key them into the register. This led John to the interesting conclusion that sometimes the ubiquitous laser scanners could make things less efficient rather than more. He also thought that the young man might be brighter than he had seemed. Smiling ruefully at his own prejudgments, John put his 3 items on the counter, saying, "Thanks." The young man again looked mildly surprised, but said, "You're welcome." Then he got the total, slid John's card through the reader, and printed out the receipt for John to sign. As John handed the paper back to the clerk, he tilted his head to the left and asked, "Hey, what's the story with that scarecrow, anyway?" The young man, clearly wrong-footed, crinkled his brow and said, "Sorry?" Looking off to his left more clearly, though he had no direct view of the tree or the figure below it, there being no window on that wall, John said, "You know, the one next to the big old pecan tree? The scarecrow." "Oh," the young man said, confirming to John's provisional satisfaction that it really was a pecan tree. And with a look of mild discomfort he concluded, "That isn't really a scarecrow." "Well, yeah, sure," John said. "I figured. There's no crops or anything growing there. Unless you count pecans, I guess. But I don't think a scarecrow would do any good to protect pecans." "No," said the clerk, as though seriously and deeply considering the point. "I guess it probably wouldn't." "Right," John said. Then, after a pause in which he fruitlessly waited for the young man to say more, he asked, "So what's the deal with it? It's a little early for Halloween, isn't it?" The question seemed again to have caught the young man off guard, but he recovered quickly and said, "Oh, no, it's not a Halloween thing. Nothing like that." John was surprised and confused. "Wait," he said. "It's not for Halloween, and it's not for scaring crows. So what is it? Why is it there? It's a bit odd." Looking mildly embarrassed, the young man said, "Well, it's sort of a local legend, I guess." "What do you mean?" John asked. "Well, they say," the young man replied, "that back a long time ago, I think it was just after World War II or something like that, there was this guy who lived around here named Joshua Caesar. He fell in love with this girl who lived nearby, but he didn't have any money, and his own family was poor. Her family didn't want her to have anything to do with him. I don't know, maybe she didn't either. Anyway, they say he sold his soul to the devil to get rich and successful and to be able to marry her. And it worked. Before too long, he owned most of the land around here and some local businesses, too. And I guess she noticed him then, or her family did, or whatever. Anyway, they say she fell in love with him and married him. But I guess the devil always gets more than people think he will. The girl liked coming up to that hill and looking out when they were working on the interstate, and there was Well, there's a couple of different versions. One says that there was an accident, another one says that she was, attacked by a worker and killed. Anyway, she died right there on that hill. They say that he planted a pecan tree to grow there because she always liked them, and then they say he killed himself. Cut his own heart out. John, who had listened to the brief tale with amused fascination, drew his head back. Cut his own heart out? That's impossible, isn't it? The young man shrugged, saying, Well, I guess for most people it would be. But they say he did sell his soul to the devil, so maybe he could do stuff other people couldn't. Anyway, they put that thing up there afterwards, like a kind of memorial, I guess, right next to the pecan tree, because he loved her, and even though he'd sold his soul, he'd done it because he loved her. Oh, Jesus Christ, Matty, that's a story junior high school girls tell. The sudden, deep voice startled John so much that he jumped in place, whirling to his right. A tall, heavy-set black man in a clean maroon pullover and tan pants stood near the entrance to the bathroom and office area of the station. He must have been there for a while, but John had been utterly unaware of his presence. Given the slightly spooky nature of the clerk's story, John found the man's sudden appearance, as well as his previous silence, disconcerting. The clerk, Matty apparently, looked a bit embarrassed, but he said, What do you mean, Mr. McGlynn? You know what I mean, the man said, strolling casually toward the counter. I mean you're telling him the romantic, tragic, silly schoolgirl story, and it's nothing like the truth. As the new man, who was apparently named McGlynn, approached, John saw that he must be quite a bit older than either the clerk or himself, because his tightly curled hair was largely gray. His physical presence, however, radiated youthful strength, and John could easily imagine that this man had once been a high school football star, or perhaps even a college player. Matty, the clerk, meanwhile said, That's the story I know. At least it's the way I first heard it. Yeah, McGlynn said. When you were in junior high, like I said. Matty grimaced slightly and muttered, I think I heard it when I was still in grade school. McGlynn came to a stop a few feet from the counter and said, Well, I guess that explains why you heard such a watered-down version of it. But you must have heard the real story since, haven't you? I mean, you've worked here for half a year. It must have come up. Now Matty looked troubled. Again muttering, he said, Well, I've heard some things, I guess. Of course you have, McGlynn said. Couldn't live here long and work here without hearing it. John, who had watched the interplay between presumed employer and employee with mild amusement, said, So what's the real story? McGlynn regarded him silently for a moment as though sizing him up, a slightly lopsided smile on his face. John thought he detected just the slightest trace of malicious glee in the expression. Then the big man nodded and said, Well, there was a man named Joshua Caesar who lived around here, and it is his story that has to do with that scarecrow up by the tree there. And he did fall in love with a girl here and get rich and successful to try to win her. John, unable to resist, asked, What, do you really think he actually sold his soul to the devil? McGlynn laughed quietly and replied, Well, I don't even know if there really is any capital D devil in the world. Not sure people really need the help sinning, you know what I mean? But there was definitely a devil in these parts in the late 40s and early 50s. What do you mean? John asked. I mean Joshua Caesar, McGlynn replied. He was the devil around here, and he fit the description from what they say, though he died before I was born. But my mom and pop knew him, and they're not prone to exaggerating. How was he the devil? John asked. He was not normally a fan of local folklore, but this was a welcome break from a long drive, and he thought it might help him wake up for the next leg of his journey. McGlynn, clearly relishing the prospect of telling the tale, took a step forward and leaned his elbow on the counter. Okay, well, Joshua was a young man who grew up near here. He was poor, just like Matty's story goes, and he also fell in love with a local girl named Allison Cheney. John gave an involuntary start, one clearly noticed by Mr. McGlynn, for he stopped his story and asked, What's the matter? John shook his head, surprised by the coincidence, though he supposed that Allison Cheney wasn't that uncommon a name. Not willing to tell the full extent of his familiarity, he simply replied, I knew a girl by that exact name, in college. McGlynn, apparently taking the revelation in stride, just nodded, but Matty, the clerk, asked, Really? John, somewhat bothered to have to say more, just nodded. Matty, his eyes wide, turned to his employer and said, Isn't that weird, Mr. McGlynn? Did he know somebody with that name? McGlynn shrugged, and echoing John's thoughts, he said, well, it's not like it's all that rare a name, and this is a big country with a lot of people. How many Matthew Carltons do you think there must be in the world? Well, yeah, sure, the young man said. But to be right here and have him know someone with the same name? It's really not important, John said, trying to conjure the truth of the words by speaking them. She's just a girl I knew in college. She was in one of my classes, and we did a project together. McGlynn eyed him closely, and John wondered whether he read more in the denial than might have been ideal. If so, the big man decided to leave the subject all but alone, simply commenting, well, I guess your Allison Cheney is probably luckier than the Allison that Joshua Caesar loved. He didn't wait for a response before saying, you see, Joshua loved her, or at least he was sweet on her from when they were pretty young. They were friends and playmates when they were little, and even went to a few dances together as teenagers. I don't get the impression that they ever really dated or had any kind of understanding, but I guess he wanted it and wished for it. This was all back in the late 30s and early 40s, though, and, well, of course, you know what was going on in the world back then, right? Of course, John replied. Nazi Germany, Japan, World War II. Exactly, McGlynn said. And, well, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, practically every able-bodied young man around here who could be spared by their families volunteered to join up and fight. At least, that's what everyone says. John, who suspected that it was pretty close to the truth, said, sure. McGlynn nodded and went on, well, Joshua Caesar, he signed up just like everybody else. I guess he wasn't any kind of devil then. And he went off to war and fought in Europe. I don't know exactly where. Anyway, he was gone for a good while, they say, and as these things happen, he lost something that he left behind. There was a young man about his age that lived nearby named Eugene Murphy, and he couldn't go to war. He'd lost part of his right leg in a farming accident when he was a teenager, so he sure couldn't join the army. But he was still a good worker and all, and he stayed and tended his family's farm and helped other people out with things that needed doing. He was a strong young man, by all accounts. Anyway, he got at least a little prosperous by local standards. And he got prosperous in another way. See, he knew Allison Cheney too, and apparently they spent a lot of time together. They were at that age, and he was one of the few young men still around. That's the way these things happen, I guess. But who knows, they might have gotten together anyway. He was a good man, if the stories are right. Anyway, they started seeing each other, and eventually they got married. And not long after that, they had a little boy. John felt slightly melancholy hearing this, comparing it to the situation with his own Allison Cheney, who might now be similarly married and procreating. He found himself sympathetic with poor Joshua Caesar, who had left his love behind for noble reasons, but had lost her just as surely as John had lost his. McGlynn continued, well, before the war was over, Joshua Caesar came home. He was wounded in the chest, fighting somewhere in the middle of Europe, and even though he insisted he was still fit for duty, they sent him home. Apparently he had a big scar right about here. McGlynn raised a fist and held it at the intersection of his chest and upper abdomen at the lower end of his sternum. In later days he used to show it to people to scare them, saying that was where his heart had been blown out by a Nazi. Or he'd sometimes say that was where the devil had taken his heart when he'd sold it while he was in Europe. I guess if the devil ever was anywhere on earth, he was probably over there at those times. Though this sounded almost too melodramatic to be serious, McGlynn looked quite somber. John, impatient, said, well, I guess you could say there were a lot of angels around then, too. A lot of good people went over to fight the Nazis. McGlynn regarded John with raised eyebrows, but shrugged and said, I suppose you could say so. That the devil himself was an angel before he fell, so they say, and I guess that still happens. John was pretty sure he knew where McGlynn was going, but he said nothing, and the big man went on. Anyway, Joshua Caesar came home, wounded, and having faced who knew what horrible things in the war, and found that the girl he loved had married someone else and was going to have a baby. Well, I'm sure that sort of thing happened to more young men than we could count, sad though it is, but I guess it took him harder than it did most. I don't mean he was heartbroken. That's natural enough. We all get that. But they say what's that thing in the Bible with the Pharaoh? The Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to let Moses' people go? John, who knew that it was God who had hardened Pharaoh's heart in the biblical tale, nevertheless just nodded. "Well," McGlynn said, "I guess Joshua Caesar hardened his heart the same way. Or maybe he just shut it down or decided it didn't matter anymore, except later to scare people. Or maybe it happened slowly, I don't know. Maybe what he did at first was honestly something he was hoping might win Allison Cheney back. Anyway, they say he turned his own family's tiny business, a farm supply store, into something truly prosperous. Then he started buying and running other businesses in the area, and farms, and getting them to be prosperous. Some people say he made deals with organized crime to do things in the background, laundering money, shipping drugs, and the like, I don't know. And some other people say he made deals with the bigger farming and food production companies to sabotage independent farmers and other local businesses, which he then took over and ran for the corporations, making them successful again. All I know is that in that time of post-war prosperity, the beginning of the baby boom, lots of people's businesses and farms failed around here, and Joshua Caesar bought them, or took them over, and suddenly they'd become more prosperous than ever before. I don't have any idea how he learned to do all this, or where his luck came from. It seems pretty likely that a lot of what he did was dirty, and a lot of people who didn't want to go along with his plans died. But they died in accidents that didn't seem to have anything suspicious about them. At least, that's what everyone says. And of course, one of the people who died was Eugene Murphy. "Ah," John breathed, "of course." McGlynn gave a cynical nod. "Of course, indeed," he said. "What's the use of having power if you can't use it to get rid of the man who married the girl you loved, right?" John didn't agree with the ethics of McGlynn's rhetorical question, but he was obviously a very different kind of person than this Joshua Caesar. Most of what McGlynn related was probably highly fictionalized anyway and bore little resemblance to the actual post-war events of the region. Nevertheless, John found the story gripping, perhaps only because of the coincidence of the girl's name, and he wanted to hear the rest. McGlynn seemed eager to oblige. He said, "Anyways, as I'm sure you can guess, it wasn't long before Joshua Caesar started trying to court the widow Allison Murphy, formerly Cheney. I've heard different versions of the story, some saying that he waited a suitable time after her husband died, others saying he hardly waited at all. Who knows what's true? I imagine it was pretty ugly, because rumors had already gotten around that he'd been behind her husband's death. Though again, everyone says that there was never anything suspicious about it, at least nothing that warranted an investigation. Anyway, the girl pretty much shot him right down. People heard her yelling at him, saying he was a monster, and that she never would have married him even if he hadn't gone off to war. She'd just never felt that way about him, all that sort of stuff. Not the sort of things that are likely to endear you to a ruthless man who's learned to get what he wants, and who may have ties to organized crime, or even to something worse." "Worse?" John asked. "What do you mean?" "Well, of course, like I said, he used to tell people that the scar on his chest was where the devil had taken his heart out when he'd sold it. Or his soul, I suppose. I don't think most people took him literally, but, well, when people died who were in his way, it often happened when absolutely no one else was around. They say that one person even got struck by lightning." "Lightning?" John asked, unable to resist smiling. McGlynn appeared to share John's amusement, for he mirrored the expression and said, "Lightning. That's what they say. Now, you and I both know there's no sense messing up a perfectly good story with facts. But it seems a lot of people, and when I say a lot, it's a surprising number, as many as dozens, I guess, came to bad ends if they were in Joshua Caesar's way, but there was never anything that pointed to him, or to any human. It was all accidents and illnesses, which, of course, made even people in the middle of the 20th century start wondering if maybe Joshua Caesar really had sold his soul to the devil and was using black magic to get rid of the people in his way." John raised his eyebrows, still smiling, though he felt a slight chill at McGlynn's second-hand speculation. "You don't really think that, do you? I mean, you don't believe in black magic or anything like that?" McGlynn tightened his lips and said, "Well, not really. This is the age of the internet, after all. But, well, I have to admit, when the weather's bad and it's raining and the wind's blowing, that scarecrow out there really does give me the willies. What about you, Matty?" He turned to look at his employee, who had been hanging raptly on his words. Matty looked embarrassed, but he said, "Well, I don't really believe in magic any more than anyone does, but I'll tell you this. If I'm going home after dark and waiting for a ride, I wait inside until they pull up. And when I go out, I don't look up that hill. I don't know, it's creepy. Well, sure, John said. That's the whole point of things like that, right? And they're supposed to be creepy. Sure, yeah, Maddie admitted. I know. But still, I don't like to look at it or be outside there after dark. John supposed that was forgivable. He himself had felt uneasy looking up the hill at the figure, and it had certainly been striking enough to get his attention even as he sped along the interstate. Such totems had psychological power, which is no doubt why people use them, even if their effect at protecting crops seemed dubious. But how does that thing connect to Joshua Caesar, anyway? John asked. I mean, it's not really supposed to be a representation of him or something, is it? It looks too new, for one thing. People can't really have put that up to remember him. I mean, why would anyone nowadays care? McGlynn smiled his slightly malicious smile again and said, Well, I'll come to that in a bit. Let me lead up to it the right way. John gave a chuckle at the man's showmanship, not bothered by the mild and comical malevolence he conveyed. Okay, he said, you're the boss. With a look of relish that could only have been enhanced if he had begun to wring his hands in anticipation, McGlynn said, Well, I guess a lot of people expected Allison Murphy, to be the next one killed. But something worse than that happened to her. Worse, anyway, for anyone who's ever had a family. By then, her son, Eugene Murphy, was about, 5 or 6 years old. Anyway, he'd started school. And this was, of course, long before helicopter parenting and all that, when every mother or father drives their kids to and from school so they don't get picked up by a child molester, even though they're probably more likely to die in a car crash during the trip than have the other thing happen. People are strange, aren't they? John nodded, never having thought of McGlynn's point before, but he was morbidly eager to hear the rest of the tale. What happened? He asked. Well, one day when the little boy was on his way to school, walking along the side of this very road, though it was even less busy back then, and he was way further down that way, he swung out the arm that was not resting on the countertop, pointing in the general direction away from the interstate. A truck drove down the road. Early morning delivery, I guess. Nothing unusual about it. Nothing unusual about kids walking along the road to get to school. Like I said, they were different times. Lots of other kids were out, and they saw what happened. Some of them are still alive, so I believe this part of the story is true. Anyway, just as the truck was coming up near where the boy was walking, I imagine him waving at it as it got closer, but that's just me. It blew a flat in its front right tire. They say it was as loud as a gunshot. And of course the driver did what he could, but his truck went off the road and right into the little Murphy boy. He died right there, killed instantly. The front of the truck crushed his chest like a paper cup. No screaming or yelling. Not by him, anyway. Just lying there, staring at the sky, looking more surprised than afraid. John felt himself gaping in horror, and he snapped his mouth shut. McGlynn could hardly have known such specifics about the boy's death, but he was a convincing storyteller. John had never been particularly paternal, and had never as an adult known a young child for whom he'd had any deep attachment. Nevertheless, he could imagine how horrible it would be to see such a tragedy, or to have it happen to one's own offspring. Now the driver, McGlynn went on, swore that the tires were only a month old, and everyone he worked with confirmed it. And when the tire was examined, they couldn't find any evidence that it had been shot out. That's what some people thought must have happened, or at least that was the rumor. But there was no bullet hole, just a rupture, some defect in the tire. Nowadays, somebody would have sued the company. If not Allison Cheney, then the driver himself, though he wasn't hurt. But finally, everyone just had to accept it as a tragedy. The more sober-headed people considered it natural, but lots of people thought it was the work of Joshua Caesar. After all, the company that owned that truck was the very first one that Joshua Caesar had run, the one he'd made from his family's business. So people said it was his way of sending a message to Allison Cheney, assigning the murder, if you want to put it that way, letting her know who'd killed the son of Eugene Murphy. Wow, John said with the release of a briefly held breath. People really thought that? Of course, McGlynn said. It's only natural. People are superstitious at the best of times, and when things are worse, well, Somehow it seems to make them feel better to think that there's someone out there behind what's happening, even if it's someone bad, instead of thinking that the world just doesn't care. At least, it makes them feel better if they don't think it through. John, who had never had any serious suspicion that the universe was anything but amoral, thought McGlynn was probably correct. The man was shrewd, that was certain, in addition to being a good storyteller. John wondered idly why such a man was managing, or more likely owned, a gas station in rural Pennsylvania when he could probably have amounted to much more. Forcing himself back to focus on the story, John asked, "So what happened then?" Mattie, leaning forward from behind the counter, nodded, clearly sharing John's curiosity. McGlynn chuckled mordantly and said, "Well, you can imagine what happened with Allison Cheney, I shouldn't wonder. She was inconsolable. She started talking to everyone she could about how Joshua Caesar really had sold his soul to the devil, how he was the devil on earth, a force of pure evil, and they had to do something about him before he destroyed them all." No one really believed her, though I imagine plenty of them sympathized. Or maybe they did believe, but didn't want to admit it. Maybe they thought that would make it worse. Maybe they were just afraid. Even the pastor of the church, when she came and begged him to intervene in the name of God, just told her that God didn't work that way, that people weren't really able to sell their souls to the devil. Well, she told him she was going to take matters into her own hands and stalked out of the church, screaming how everyone in the whole area were nothing but cowards, but that she wasn't afraid. She'd already lost everything that mattered to her, and if God couldn't help her, then she'd have to help herself. McGlynn came to a halt, staring off into space pensively. John glanced at Mattie, who glanced back at him. Then John looked back at McGlynn. "So," he asked, "what did she do? Did she get revenge?" McGlynn gave another mordant chuckle, and this one surprised John by raising gooseflesh on his arms, for it was a sound of pure, contemptuous amusement, someone who thought justice might be done in the world. "Revenge?" he asked. "No, she didn't get revenge. She might have really meant to, or she might have just been blowing off steam. But the next time people saw her, she wasn't standing over Joshua Caesar's corpse with a smoking gun or a bloody knife. She was hanging from the rafters in her family's house. Apparently, she'd killed herself." "Apparently?" John asked, puzzled by the qualifier. "Well, there were people who thought she hadn't actually done it herself," McGlynn replied. "I guess it wasn't obvious how she got up there, though I think people who really decided to end their own lives can be pretty determined. But a lot of people thought that Joshua Caesar had done it, or had it done, and just made it look like suicide, though apparently there wasn't any sign of a struggle, which just made some people say he'd done it by witchcraft, black magic, whatever, made her do it herself, or magicked her up into the noose somehow." John, though he felt a new chill, raised a skeptical eyebrow. Out of the corner of his eye he saw that the clerk, Mattie, bore a much more credulous expression and was plainly unnerved. McGlynn, apparently noting John's look of doubt, smirked and said, "Also, her body disappeared before they could bury her." "Really?" Mattie interjected, horrified fascination written all over his face. "That's what they say," McGlynn confirmed. "And it seems pretty well confirmed by the newspapers from back then. Someone stole the body out of the mortuary before the funeral. Someone who didn't have to break in. And then, of course, right after that," he looked off over John's shoulder as though staring through the wall of his station, saying, "someone planted that pecan tree up on the hill." John, against his own rational urgings, looked over his shoulder, but of course he saw nothing but the wall of the station, the coffee service area and microwave, and the meager supply of cup ramen noodles. In his mind's eye, though, he could see the towering tree, swaying slightly in the breeze, guarding its macabre neighbor. "Wait," he said, turning back to face McGlynn. "If that tree was planted in, 1950 or so? Then it's only 60 or 70 years old. Is it possible for it to have gotten so big in that time? I mean, this isn't even the usual place for pecan trees to grow." "I know," McGlynn said, "but it was planted around then, and grow this big it did. I've seen it over the course of my life. I guess it was planted in just the right place, or maybe there was something special about the soil it was planted in." Confused, John asked, "What do you mean?" With a surprised look, McGlynn responded, "Isn't it obvious? Almost everyone thought Allison Cheney's body was buried there, with a tree planted on top of it. See, just like Mattie said, Allison Cheney always did love pecans. Some people thought it was a way of Joshua Caesar showing at least a bit of remorse over what he'd done and giving her that last gift of planting a pecan tree over her body. Others said it was his final insult to her. You want pecans? I'll give you pecans. You can have all the pecans your corpse can eat. That sort of thing. But if everyone thought her body'd been stolen and buried there, why didn't they just dig it up and see? John asked. I mean, that would have been a crime, right? To steal her body and bury it there? I guess it would have been, McGlynn said. But this was private land, owned, of course, by Joshua Caesar. In fact, that hill looked over a whole big stretch of land that was some of the first that he ever owned. And to dig it up, they'd have needed a warrant or some kind of court order. And no one was going to swear out a warrant like that against Joshua Caesar. Not around here. Not when there were other ways of doing things. John thought he caught an ominous note to McGlynn's last sentence. What do you mean? He asked. The chilly, malicious smile came back to McGlynn's face, and it was now more frightening. Well, not long after that, people here decided that enough was enough. Some did, anyway. They probably felt guilty for standing by for so long, just letting things happen, letting Joshua Caesar have his way. Anyway, one night, they say it was Allison Cheney's little boy's birthday, but I don't know about that. One night they came to Joshua Caesar's big house. I always imagined them storming up with pitchforks and torches, but they more likely came with shotguns, hunting rifles, and flashlights. Anyway, they didn't have any trouble getting there or getting inside. There were no guards around the place, and Joshua Caesar lived alone. I don't know why he didn't try to stop them or to escape, but I guess his magic wasn't strong enough to warn him. Or maybe the devil deserted him. I suspect, if there is a devil, that he always welches on his deals when push comes to shove. Anyway, the villagers, I always think of them as villagers. I hope you don't mind, it just seems right. They confronted him and accused him of his crimes. By all accounts, he wasn't the least bit afraid. Laughed at them, they said. Scared some of them almost to the point where their nerve broke. But a mob has strength that none of its members have and can do things no one would do if they were alone and in their right mind. So they set on him and held him down on his kitchen table, and they cut him open. Mattie gasped, but John said, What do you mean, they stabbed him to death? More than that, McGlynn replied. I guess they decided they wanted some poetic justice, and since he'd always scared people by telling them that he'd gotten his heart blown out or had cut it out and sold it to the devil, they'd make his story come true. Now, what probably happened is just that. They cut the bastard's heart out and killed him. Well, he probably died before they'd finished. Who knows what happened to it? Most likely burned somewhere. That's what I'd do if I was them. But some people say that when they cut him open, right in the place where his scar was, below his breastbone and up through the bottom of his chest, that they found nothing there. His heart really had been gone, and he'd been living on without it. Mattie covered his mouth, truly a satisfying audience for a Gothic tale such as McGlynn's. John, though a troubling image arose in his mind of a gaping, empty hole in the middle of a prostrate man's chest, nevertheless could not let a logical inconsistency go without comment. Wait, he said. If he was supposed to have been living all those years without a heart, which is obviously impossible, but like you said, stories don't need to be too worried about facts, then why would cutting open his chest kill him? McGlynn shrugged, still smiling, and it was obvious to John that the big man had long since noticed that plot hole himself. Who knows, he said. Maybe cutting his chest open broke whatever spell had kept him alive. Maybe he didn't die. Or maybe, more likely, he had a heart just as much as everyone else, and they cut it out, and he died from that. Anyway, die he did, by all accounts, and the killers had to decide what to do with his body. They weren't worried about getting in trouble for killing him. It wasn't as though anyone was going to miss him, and there was enough of them together that they could vouch for one another being miles away at the time of the murder. But I guess their wish for poetic justice wasn't quite satisfied yet. So they got some old, oversized clothes, some gloves, some boots, and a burlap sack. They put him in those, put the sack over his head. Somebody actually cut a mouth and eye slits in it, then stitched him back closed with twine, supposedly so he couldn't see or speak any more evil. I've always thought that seemed pretty stupid, but I guess that's superstition for you. And what about the ears? Did they block those? Not that I ever heard. He chuckled at the expense of whatever foolish person had thought such gestures would matter before saying, Then they brought him up to that hill and tied the body to the cross up there, right next to the tree that he'd planted only a little bit before. And that was his final resting place. In this world, anyway. A silent pause followed, Matty looking rapt and wonder-filled, McGlynn half smiling over a contemplative expression. John, though he'd enjoyed the story, had another question. So, he said, do they keep on replacing or maintaining that thing? I guess you'd call it a scarecrow, even though I know it's not for crows. Has someone been keeping it up since then? Matty squinched his nose and crinkled his brow, clearly not getting John's point, but McGlynn gave another of his dark smiles and said, Oh, no. No one maintains it. It's been there ever since, just like the tree, just as it is. No one's changed or fixed a thing. John pulled his head back slightly. That's impossible, he said. I mean, I didn't get a good look at it, but the clothes, the head, all of it, it's all in good shape. I mean, if it had been there for more than 60 years, they'd have faded. They'd have fallen apart by now. The post would rot, and I don't even want to think about what might have happened if there was a real person under those clothes. Some animal would have eaten at a body if it had been left there. Somebody's got to be maintaining it or replacing it. Matty just looked confused, but McGlynn clearly took John's point and just as clearly had thought of it himself. He said, I hear what you're saying. You also got to wonder about wind and rain and snow and ice, everything else that should have knocked it down by now. I don't know what to say about that. All I can tell you for sure is it's been there as long as I can remember, and it's always looked the same. Kids will sometimes dare each other to get up close to it and even touch it, and during the day some of them do, though as far as I know no one's ever touched it after dark. And no one's tried to knock it down or anything like that. But no one maintains it either. John, not willing to take the report at face value, said, Well, no one you know of. Of course, McGlynn admitted, and here he seemed less amused, more thoughtful. It's possible that someone's coming out here every now and then to keep the thing up. They could change out its clothes and its bag, even its boots and gloves, fix the post and the crossbar. But they'd have to have been doing it at least as long as I've been alive, and they'd have to have been doing it perfectly, because I haven't ever seen anything out of place, like you'd think there'd be if someone had, say, changed out an old shirt for a new one. Also, they'd have to have done it when no one saw them. At night, I guess, because the station's open 7 days a week, and I don't know of anyone ever seeing anyone go over there. Still, it could be done, John said, though he recognized the difficulties McGlynn had described. He also recognized that he had only McGlynn's word that nothing had changed. For all he knew, McGlynn himself was the one who maintained the scarecrow. It wasn't that great as advertising went, but it was a conversation starter, and had certainly drawn John into the station. Adding the local legend-telling would serve to cement the scarecrow and the gas station in the memory of anyone who passed. Interrupting John's speculations, McGlynn said, Yes, I suppose it could be done. People have done harder things than that. You'd have to wonder why they'd do it, but people have done stranger things too, so it's not impossible. But for someone to go to all that bother for all those years would be almost as unnatural as the thing just always staying the same. John wasn't quite sure he agreed with that assessment, but since he had his own suspicions, he didn't feel pressured to explore the possibilities. Well, it's an interesting story, he said. This has been one of the most memorable gassing ups I've ever done. McGlynn smiled, saying, Pleased to hear it. Hopefully that means you'll stop here again on your way back the other way, if you're going the other way. And that, as far as John was concerned, cemented the case for his suspicion that McGlynn himself had made, or at least maintained, the scarecrow and used it to draw in customers. He didn't mind. In fact, he found it both admirable and original. The man knew how to tell a story, and he knew how to set one up as well. So thinking, John said, I'm sure I will. Matty had already run John's card, and he quickly put his purchases in a plastic bag and handed them over. After wishing both the clerk and his boss well, John turned and walked out of the gas station. John considered having a cigarette before he left, but the cloud cover had persisted, giving the whole area a gloomy feel. Glancing up at the tree and at the effigy of Joshua Caesar, he decided that it wasn't a scene he wanted to relish. That was a shame, really, because the surrounding countryside was truly beautiful, with its rolling, partially wooded hills and mainly bucolic human presence. Even McGlynn's gas station, though run down, had a certain charm. If not for the story, and for the honestly disquieting presence of the scarecrow with its sewn-shut eyes and mouth, John might have lingered. Perhaps McGlynn's tale wasn't quite the good marketing scheme John had thought it was. Now that he was outside, in the presence of the tale's subject, he wasn't sure he wanted to stop back on his way home. Looking at the Scarecrow as he opened his car door, he even felt that McGlynn's cynical and teasing smile might be more sinister than it had felt inside the station. Shrugging to himself, knowing that he didn't have to make any decision about such things anytime soon, John brought himself down into the low seat of the Mustang and shut the door. He put his bag of unhealthy groceries on the passenger seat, partially covering his nearly empty pack of cigarettes. He put the key in the ignition and turned it, and his own heart, such as it was, sank. The starter cranked, trying its best to turn the engine over, but the V8 refused to be coaxed. John turned the key back and sat still for a moment. "Son of a bitch," he said quietly. He stepped down on the gas and released it, wondering if he could have flooded the engine, not even really sure how to remedy such a thing. Though his current closest friend was a mechanic, John knew only slightly more about cars than Rob did about computers. He just knew that the beast had been given a clean bill of health and declared unequivocally ready for a cross-country trip. Turning the key again brought no different response than before. The starter cranked and cranked, but the engine didn't so much as sputter. John was at least assured that the battery was in excellent shape, since the dashboard lights didn't dim even slightly when he turned the starter. The warning symbols were all dark. There was no indication that something might be wrong with the functions they were built to monitor, which was as it ought to be. Everything in the car had been optimized immediately prior to John leaving New Jersey, and it had been running like a dream. "Motherfucker," he spat to himself. He took the key from the ignition, opened the door, and stepped out of the car. He got down and looked under the front end, trying to see if there was any sign of leakage, but all he saw was a typical and quite minor drip of condensation from the AC unit. No vital fluids had oozed from the car's workings. Standing back up, he glanced at the hill. A stiff breeze blew, stirring the leaves in the pecan tree, giving the strange impression that the great plant was alarmed. Below it, the wind caught the clothes of the Scarecrow figure, highlighting once again that its chest was partly hollow. And John knew now why its makers had chosen that effect. The wind also caught the burlap sack on the thing's head, pulling it taut. This gave the disturbing impression that its sewn-shut eye was looking slightly in John's direction. Worse, the slit-entwined mouth, its corner pulled back and up, seemed to be smiling. It was not a reassuring smile. John tore his eyes and mind away from the thing and walked briskly back toward the gas station. When he stepped through the door, ringing its tiny chime, he found both Maddie and McGlynn still in the main area of the station, Maddie lounging behind the counter and McGlynn puttering among the displays, perhaps inventorying his wares. They both looked up with evident surprise when John came back into the building. "Forget something?" McGlynn asked. John sighed. "Yeah," he said, "I forgot to drive a better car. Mine won't start." He felt guilty for bad-mouthing Rob's handiwork, but he was terribly frustrated. He would apologize in spirit to his friend if and when he got the Mustang moving again. McGlynn stepped forward a bit, cocking his head. "Is it the battery?" he asked. "No," John said, "it's got a brand-new battery. And besides, the lights and the other electrical systems are fine, and the starter's turning fine. I just can't get the engine to go. I don't know why. Everything was checked out before I left. Fresh oil, all the other fluids, and it's been running perfectly up to the moment I pulled in." McGlynn looked mildly puzzled, but Maddie seemed frankly alarmed, saying, "That's really weird, don't you think, Mr. McGlynn? Why would his car not start?" He glanced toward the wall to his right, and John guessed that he was thinking of McGlynn's dark tail. McGlynn seemed irritated by Maddie's obvious speculation, which led John to think he took it more seriously than might be expected. An amused roll of the eyes would have been more reassuring. In a tense voice, the big man said, "Don't start imagining things, Maddie. It's a car, and cars break down from time to time. Things fall apart. That's just what they do." Then, rubbing his hands together, he said, "Okay, well, I'm not a mechanic, but I have run a gas station for quite a long time. Maybe I can figure out what's wrong with it." John felt a surge of relief and said, "That'd be really great. Thanks." "Don't thank me yet," McGlynn said. "Thank me if I can get you running." Then he joined John, and they walked toward the door, leaving Maddie behind to mind the otherwise empty shop. McGlynn was wise in advising John not to thank him, for though he tried the engine himself, and though he popped the hood, looked in, and poked around, the big man reported that everything appeared to be in good order. He even made admiring comments about the state of the engine and the other internal workings of the Mustang. John was pleased on Rob's behalf and tried to store away the compliments to relate to his friend later, but that was hardly his current priority. Right now, he just wanted to get the car running, and unfortunately, McGlynn didn't seem able to help him achieve that goal. Also, even as he explored the car, McGlynn kept glancing up at the tree and the scarecrow on the hill with a worried expression. The clouds had cemented their dominion over the sky, and the afternoon was a dreary gray, becoming quite cool for the time of year. John could almost have thought that it was Halloween, if not for the fact that all the nearby foliage was green. In between McGlynn's glances up the hill, John cast a few looks there himself. The wind was still out of the west, and as before, it drew the burlap sack back against whatever gave it form, creating a distorted and leering expression, one that seemed directed toward him, or at least toward the gas station. John wondered what they had used to make the head shape under the burlap. Whatever it was convincing. He thought of McGlynn's story and the claim that the scarecrow was the body of Joshua Caesar, but of course, a corpse would long ago have deteriorated too much to maintain such a figure. Anyway, no one really would have made a scarecrow out of a dead man's body, no matter how hated the man. This wasn't the Middle Ages. Someone would have said something. Someone would have done something. Wouldn't they? Someone must have maintained the scarecrow for all those years, updating it, fixing it, replacing parts as they disintegrated. As for McGlynn's station that the thing had always stayed the same and showed no signs of tampering, well, either he was fooling himself or he was part of the gag. Maddie, at least, would need little convincing. Looking back from the tree, John found McGlynn staring at it again as well. His expression was not that of a clever conspirator. It was nervous. He glanced down from where he stood at the front of the car, giving yet another cursory look at the engine, then looked back up at the hill, which was now behind John. He didn't look amused. He looked speculative. He looked scared. Turning back to John, he said, "Okay, well, let's put the hood down. I don't have any idea what's wrong, but it's got to be something." When John nodded and started forward, the big man followed his own recommendation and lowered the hood. The crash of it falling into place felt strangely distant and muffled. "Here," McGlynn said next, unconsciously wiping his hands on his pants, which gave John a slight twinge as he saw black grime mar the neatly laundered khakis. "Come back inside. There's a good mechanic on the other side of town. They can come out and tow you over to their garage so they can figure out what's wrong. And they won't rip you off just because you're a stranger who's in trouble. I've got their number in the office." John, who'd been planning to get on his smartphone and check the internet for local mechanics and towing, felt a surge of relief at this news. He was reassured not so much by McGlynn's words as by the tone in which he said them. He sounded distracted, as if sharing an afterthought. Indeed, he seemed deeply preoccupied, and even as John followed him back toward the door, he saw the big man frequently glance to his left, toward the tree and the scarecrow. John forced himself not to look. He was not superstitious, but he couldn't look at that figure's face, twisted by the wind, without imagining a desiccated skull under the burlap, a skull that was not quite as dead as it ought to be after having been there for almost 70 years. The gloomy sky was oppressive, and John found visceral relief when he passed through the imperfectly transparent door and re-entered the gas station proper. McGlynn didn't look back as he strode toward the office area and disappeared into its surprisingly deep confines. Maddie, who had looked up as the pair entered, asked, "What's wrong with it?" For a split instant, John thought he was referring to the scarecrow, for that was what was on his mind. He quickly course-corrected and replied, "I have no idea. Everything looks like it ought to be fine." Maddie seemed pensive, but sounded slightly hopeful as he said, "Well, it's a kind of old car, right? I mean, things can always go wrong, like Mr. McGlynn said." John frowned, defensively irritated by Maddie's speculation. "No," he said, "it shouldn't have anything wrong. I have a friend who's a very good mechanic, and he's put his heart and soul into making that thing like new. It's been running better than just about any car I've ever driven, all the way from Central Jersey. Nothing should be wrong with it." Maddie looked troubled. After a moment's pause and another glance at the wall to his right, he said, "Well, something's got to have gone wrong, right? I mean, otherwise why won't it start?" John looked back at Maddie, all too easily reading from his expression that he had suspicions that he didn't want to entertain, or at least to speak aloud. John was pretty sure what those suspicions were. Given the story McGlynn had just told, Maddie was no doubt thinking that the spirit of Joshua Caesar, or at least of the scarecrow under the pecan tree, was somehow interdicting the working of John's car. John wished he could feel contempt toward the young man's fear. He didn't normally relish looking down on others, but in this case he would have welcomed it, because he himself, however weakly, entertained the same fear that was surely going through the clerk's head. It was ridiculous, of course. Much of McGlynn's story had likely been fiction, or at least highly embellished by time and retelling. Even McGlynn had said that there was no sense ruining a perfectly good story with the facts. There was no way that the scarecrow on the hill had ever really been made from the corpse of Joshua Caesar. Even if it had been, in the beginning, which it surely hadn't, a body would long since have fallen apart, eaten by insects, frozen and thawed dozens of times, along with the clothes and sack that wrapped it. The wooden cross, even if made from the sturdiest oak, would have fallen to pieces with rot and weather after 70 years. And even if, against all odds, the remains of the local malefactor had somehow survived intact the passage of 7 decades, that would be no reason to think that it had some supernatural power, some ability to reach out and prevent a car from starting. That was no more possible than it was that Joshua Caesar had sold his soul, or his heart, to the devil somewhere on the battlefields of Europe in World War II. It was nonsense. Pacts with the devil, black magic, evil totems. These things made fine stories, but they were not real. John gave a start as McGlynn spoke loudly, coming back through the doorway from the rear of the station. "Sorry about that," the big man said. "I had to dig in my desk a little to find the number." He held a white business card in his right hand, which he extended even as he approached. "No problem," John said. "I appreciate you getting it." He took the card and looked at it. It bore a simple, almost childish drawing of a tow truck, next to which were the words, "Easy Service," with an address and phone number below. It wasn't a particularly imaginative name for a business, but there presumably wasn't a lot of local competition, so there was no need to be clever. Just being a decent mechanic would probably be enough to keep a place in business. John hoped that was true. He dialed the number, which was answered after only 2 rings. He explained his situation and gave his location, asking McGlynn and Matty to give him the address, though he supposed he could have just said the gas station by the interstate and it would have served as well. His enthusiasm and relief were dampened slightly when he was told that the tow truck was currently out on another job, but that as soon as it was done, it would come by and pick him up. He must have looked glum as he ended the call, because even as he put his phone away, Matty asked, "What's the matter?" "Oh, nothing," John said. "It's just going to be an hour or so. The tow truck's out getting someone else right now, but as soon as they get that done, they'll come over here to get me." John didn't know what Matty might have been imagining, but it must have been bad, because he looked almost comically relieved when he said, "Oh, well, that's okay then. You can just wait in here if you want. Isn't that right, Mr. McGlynn?" McGlynn, who had stood nearby through the course of John's call, said, "Of course. Have some coffee if you want, on the house." He waved an arm toward the wall of the room beyond which lay the hill, the tree, and the scarecrow. John looked at the twin pots of coffee, wondering how long they'd been sitting there, not that he was above drinking day-old coffee, and realized that he had no desire for it. "Thanks," he said, and he handed the Easy Service card back to McGlynn. "I'll probably have some in a little bit, but right now—" He felt at his pockets in a rather absurd pantomime, as though trying to find something that he already knew would not be there. "I think I'm going to have a smoke." With a rueful smile, he added, "And, of course, I left my cigarettes in the car." Both McGlynn and Matty looked alarmed by John's declaration, though Matty's case was much more severe. John doubted that they were worried about his lungs, and it was almost amusing to see the evidence of each man's internal struggle with fear and credulity. Matty had the least success, and he said, "Are you sure you wouldn't rather wait till the tow truck gets here?" "Nah," John replied, meaning that he was sure. "I haven't had a cigarette in an hour or so already. Anyway, I need to call my mechanic friend and curse him out. He swore to me that this car was in great shape for the drive to Chicago." McGlynn and Matty exchanged troubled glances, but McGlynn just said, "Okay, well, stay away from the pumps if you don't mind." "Of course," John said, though without the admonition he might very well not have thought to avoid igniting a flame next to great reservoirs of gasoline. He turned toward the door, and even as he began to move, Matty said, "You may want to smoke over on this side of the building." He waved his arm toward the snacks and the drink refrigerators. "The view's not as good, but—" He trailed off, clearly embarrassed by his own fear. John, who found Matty's concern endearing, smiled and said, "Don't worry about me. I'm not a crow, and I like to watch traffic. I'll be fine." Matty and McGlynn once again exchanged glances, but Matty just nodded resignedly, and McGlynn said, "All right, then." To Matty, the big man added, I'll be in the back, but call me when the tow truck comes, okay? Yes, sir, Matty replied. John gave a tiny wave and strode through the door. Outside, the cloud cover hadn't changed, so the afternoon was dim and morose, still more like autumn than spring. The wind had diminished to just the slightest breeze, which was fine with John since the cloudiness had made the day cool. He wasn't wearing his jacket, and he didn't want to get it out of the trunk. He'd hoped, in fact, not to need anything at all out of his luggage until the moment he pulled up to the Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago. That was where he had reservations, fulfilling a long-standing idle dream from his college days. He feared that those plans would now be slightly altered. Even if the local mechanics at Easy Service were nearly superhuman in their speed and skills, it seemed unlikely that he was going to get back on the interstate in less than 3 or 4 hours. Going around to the passenger side of the Mustang, John swung the door open and reached into the passenger seat. Though tempted to fish the fresh Newports from his bag of dubious treats, he did the practical thing and moved it, picking up the almost empty pack underneath. Closing the door again, he flipped the pack's top open and pulled out one of the 3 cigarettes within, sticking it in his mouth. He almost forgot McGlynn's warning, but even as he reached for his lighter, he glanced over his shoulder at the gas pump. He shook his head and walked toward the rear of his car, palming his Bic for the moment. As he came around the end of the Mustang, he paused. He glanced at the station, then looked past where the pickup truck was parked. Matty was right. There was not much to see there, just a ratty old vacant field, a few modest trees, then the beginning of the row of worn-down businesses. Even a true enthusiast of Americana would not have been excited over that stretch of semi-rural heartland, and John was no such enthusiast. When he turned his gaze to the left, he saw the hill, the tree, and its much smaller companion. Oddly, though the tree towered over the wood-mounted figure, it had less physical presence. John snuck himself toward the notion that the tree seemed almost timid, afraid, if such a thing were possible, of the sinister shape planted near it. He knew the source of that thought. It was the product of McGlynn's well-told story, coupled with Matty's ill-concealed superstition, and McGlynn's own less prominent but evident misgivings. John wanted to laugh at himself, but while looking at the scarecrow on the hill, he was unable to summon amusement. The thing really was disquieting. Any sane person would want to spare themselves its presence. Thus concluding, John strode to his left, away from the pickup truck and the road leading into what must have been town. Once he judged himself far enough away from the pumps, he flicked his lighter into flame and drew in a breath of smoke. "Lucky for me," he said aloud, "I'm not quite sane." He forced himself to stare at the scarecrow, so well articulated in its joints, such an excellent facsimile of a body, but far too intact to be 70 years old. With the slackening of the wind's force, the expression on the thing's face had changed. It no longer grinned, but still seemed to look at John out of the corner of its sewn-shut eye. Its mouth was drawn slightly down now, giving an impression of contempt, as though it were figuratively, as well as literally, looking down on him. John took a deep drag on his cigarette, relishing the harsh feeling of the smoke entering his lungs and staring willfully up the scarecrow's face. As he breathed the smoke out, he whispered, "Fuck you." Most of his expletive was directed at the baleful presence on the hill, but some of it, more than he'd like to admit, was directed at Allison Cheney. His Allison Cheney. An Allison Cheney that had very different priorities from those of the poor woman in the tale about old, dead Joshua Caesar. John hadn't been a smoker when he'd met Allison, nor at any time before. It had simply never been something he'd wanted to do. It hadn't bothered him when other people smoked. He could be the only person not lit up in a room full of smokers and would not feel troubled. The smell neither pleased nor irritated him, and the habit itself neither impressed nor disturbed him. Allison had not shared his detachment. Allison hated smoking with the fervor of a religious fanatic denouncing sin. John knew some of that hate was because her father, with whom she'd had a stormy relationship, had struggled with smoking for as long as he'd been alive and had finally had the battle taken from him when he had died of lung and kidney cancer at a young age. Allison's anger about the habit was no doubt partly a defense against her own feelings of guilt and bereavement, and John could hardly hold it against her. But she had been so vehement. He'd heard her say on more than one occasion that she didn't understand why people who still smoked, now that everyone knew how harmful it was, didn't just kill themselves and stop being pussies about it. The world would be better off without them, and everyone else's air would be a little bit cleaner. A paragon of empathy and tolerance, Allison was not, and though it was but a tiny part of her otherwise charming personality, it sometimes ruined friendships. Once Allison had given up on John, one of the first changes he'd made was to take up smoking. He found it neither unpleasant nor especially gratifying. He hadn't had any cliché coughing fits or lightheadedness when lighting up his first smoke, though he had felt strangely guilty when buying the pack. This, finally, had only hardened his resolve, and he had begun smoking regularly. He was not a heavy smoker. A pack could sometimes last him almost 2 days, but he smoked as if out of duty. This was his declaration of independence, his too emphatic response to thoughts of Allison, a statement that he did not need her, nor did he need to please her. A new gust of wind sprang up and pushed the bag mask back against whatever formed the shape of the Scarecrow's head. The smile thus produced looked as contemptuous as Allison could ever have looked toward his smoking, and John wouldn't have been surprised to hear a derogatory snort of laughter and the sarcastic words, "Yeah, right," in response to his thoughts. Well, yes, he would have been surprised, but oddly enough he didn't think he would have been all that surprised. "Fuck you," he said again, with more force but less conviction. The Scarecrow seemed to laugh. John wondered again why he was dwelling so much on Allison today. He'd kept his thoughts away from her for so long. It seemed almost that he'd been fighting with them for decades, for longer than he'd been alive. He'd avoided bringing up her name for the last year, perhaps a bit longer. Why had he suddenly started to think about her? Come to think of it, exactly when had he started to think about her? He searched back. It had been very recently. Had it been before he'd seen the tree on the hill? Just after he'd seen it? Had it been before he'd seen the tree's ill-omened companion? It was before he'd heard the story. If it had been after he'd heard the story, if he'd begun then to reminisce about his great love, lost not through tragedy but apathy, he could hardly have been surprised. The name of the woman in the story was Allison Cheney, after all. Such coincidences could hardly fail to be evocative, even if the law of large numbers guaranteed that they would happen from time to time. Then he couldn't have blamed himself for thinking of her. That hadn't been the order of events, though. He'd started thinking of Allison while still on the interstate. Even while cresting the last hill before the one near which he stood, he had begun to think of her. Maybe a little before, maybe a little after, but it had been right around then. What had triggered those thoughts? He couldn't recall the stream of consciousness that had cast open those dungeons of memory. He drew in another drag from the cigarette, already having nearly finished it. Why did you really take up smoking after she left you? The thought was so precisely articulated that it almost seemed to come from outside John's head, but he recognized the mental voice as his own. It was a question he'd already considered, so he wondered why it sprang back into his mind now. Because you know what you thought before was a lie. A small part of the reason you smoke is defiance, but only a small part. You try not to think about the real reason, though you joke about it. John shook his head. He didn't know why these thoughts were arising. He knew why he started smoking. The reasons were plain to him. You're only looking at the surface. You know there's a deeper reason. Shut up, he said to himself, and flicked the butt of his cigarette onto the nearby pavement, suppressing a brief pang of guilt over littering. The guilt annoyed him, and he tried to chalk it up to the same influences that made him feel ashamed of smoking, but he knew that was only partly true. He honestly did care about the environment. You don't like to care about things, do you? He frowned. This was getting annoying. He normally kept his mind under a reasonable degree of control, but on this road trip he'd somehow gotten into a peculiar state that combined self-indulgence with self-reproach. It was an unpleasant combination, and he wanted to be rid of it. He was eager for the tow truck to arrive, but he knew that the time it took to light and smoke one cigarette was nowhere near what easy service had predicted would be necessary. Maybe the trip had been a bad idea. If he was getting gloomy already, how would he be once he got back to Chicago? Or perhaps he'd be okay if he just went to the city but didn't go to the university. Maybe he should avoid Longgrove, too, since that was a place he'd gone with Allison. Ah, you are a coward, aren't you? John felt his lips curl and his nostrils flare in irritation. He was not a coward. He simply knew how he wanted to live his life, knew the futility of trying to make a difference in the world, the wasted energy that went into accomplishment and achievement when everyone arrived at the same destination in the end. He wanted to live with as little stress and angst as he could achieve, with as little life as he could achieve. Once again he said, "Fuck you," but this time it was almost a whisper. He pulled out another cigarette and lit it, taking a forceful inhalation, so deep that he almost coughed. "You didn't really take up smoking as a matter of defiance. You've never been a defiant person, and whom would you be defying anyway? You took it up the way some people take up skydiving or mountain climbing. You took it up as a way of committing small-scale suicide." "Shut up," he said to himself, surprised to hear that his spoken voice felt so distinct from the one inside his head. The cloud cover must have been thickening, because the day felt significantly darker than it had before. "You don't have the courage or the conviction to kill yourself outright, but you know that your life is empty. When she left you, you lost what little heart you had. Now there's nothing left, nothing beating to keep your soul alive. There's nothing but a hole there. In that, if in no other way, you're like me." John's head snapped up. What had he just thought? It had been his own voice, hadn't it? The thoughts had certainly felt like his, yet the phrasing had been strange. He could have sworn that he'd been thinking to himself in second person, and that the person thinking took a point of view other than his own. He forced himself to look up the hill. A gust of wind blew again, pulling the face of the Scarecrow back into a malicious smile. This was nothing like McGlynn's harmless, playful mischief, but was true, unmitigated ill will. If John had seen that face at night, hard-nosed realist though he was, he surely would have been spooked. He might even have been terrified. The wind forced the figure's shirt back again, pressing it into the chest, outlining the hollow there, some trick of wind currents allowing it to suck in rather than be stretched out flat from the sides. The torso was hollow, as though it had been cut open just below or at the bottom of the breastbone, and whatever was inside had been removed. Of course, there was no actual torso. It was just a facsimile created by some talented lover of local legends, maintained over the years surreptitiously to continue the local campfire story of Joshua Caesar. John took another drag in his cigarette, almost as deep as the last, then flicked a long ash off the end. "Ashes," the thought came. "That's all that's left of your soul, isn't it? Nothing but ashes and dust. If it ever was anything but ash to begin with." John shook his head. He had to stop this, had to stop speaking to himself this way. It wasn't like him. He was saying things he didn't want to think. Why didn't he want to think them? Because they were false? Or because they were true? Why was he thinking them? The voice was his. He was almost sure of that, but the words, they were ideas he might have formulated, but not quite in the way they were coming. Ashes, hearts, hollowness, these things weren't his mode of operation. He had some liberal arts education, but he was a techie by nature. Computer metaphors, software metaphors, programming metaphors, these were the dominant styles of his thought. Yes, cold metaphors, mechanical metaphors, metaphors without heart. These are the kinds of programs that you run in what you wouldn't have the courage to call your soul, aren't they? "Stop it," John said, no longer sure that he was talking to himself, but not willing to entertain the notion that he might be talking to someone else. Right now, there was only one other figure to whom he might be talking. The gust of wind died, and John watched the face of the Scarecrow twist downward again, becoming a disapproving frown. "You are weak and soft by nature. You've always been so. You have gifts, you have power, but you have never had will. You could have been a giant to stride the earth, like the mythic figures of Genesis, but your heart is tiny, and what little was there has been burned out of you by your refusal to act." "Shut up," he whispered, and this time he directed his speech toward the Scarecrow. Though no human ears could have heard his soft words from such a distance, he didn't think any human ears were listening. He was speaking to a voice inside his head. It was his own voice, it had to be, but it was not a part of him that loved himself. "How pathetic you are. You would have been better suited for the Allison Janney who lived here, whose corpse lies beneath this tree and feeds its mindless vegetation so well. And how better suited for me would your Allison Janney be? She would recognize the rightness of my ways. John's mouth dropped open. He might have laughed at his own expression had he seen it from outside, out of context, but he didn't feel like laughing now, for he realized that the voice, inside his head though it was, did not purport to be his own. Its words made that clear. It was the voice of the Scarecrow. It was the voice of Joshua Caesar. "That's not possible," he said, speaking not to the other voice but to himself, though his own voice carried little conviction. "How little you know of what is possible. How little you understand. You think only in terms of what you've learned in your narrow studies of silicon and wires, of written codes and numerical logic. I have seen beneath this. I have seen deeper into what you would call the operating system of reality. I knew it even when I was younger, and I learned much more in the warlands of Europe. I learned the power of my will." John gaped up at the Scarecrow. The wind did not gust again, but John had the misgiving that the head might be turned ever so slightly more toward him than it had been before. No, that was just because he was standing farther back against the wall of the gas station. His angle was different. It was a trick of parallax. But then, why would it seem different now than it had only moments before? He hadn't moved since then, had he? He didn't think he had. He didn't think he'd shifted. Still, maybe without thinking, without realizing it, he'd paced sideways a bit. Surely an unconscious sidestep was more likely than for a corpse, dead for more than half a century, to shift its stiff neck to look at him. He had read a long time ago about how to test for the truth of the supernatural. Some philosopher had advised that if you think you see a miracle, ask yourself what's more likely, that the laws of nature have been suspended or that your senses have been fooled. Only if it was the first should you credit the miracle. But what do you know about the laws of nature? What do you really know? You only know the laws you've been taught. You only know the superficial logic of the program. But if the program contains possibilities which aren't clear to the casual user, then couldn't things be possible that would surprise the uninitiated? Might there not be cheat codes about which you, a mere novice, would know nothing? John shook his head, unable to believe what was roiling through it, a voice that sounded like his own, but with words he would never have spoken. He stared at the Scarecrow, his cigarette perilously close to falling from his mouth. It stayed in place only because it was stuck to his dry lower lip. The voice in his head was pretending to be the Scarecrow, pretending that there really was a body on that wooden cross, pretending that it was the body of Joshua Caesar. He must be losing his mind. That was why he had started to think of Allison. Going back to Chicago must have pushed him over an edge he hadn't known he'd been skirting. How long had he been cracking up? How long had he been deteriorating? Others around him might not even have noticed. He wasn't the most gregarious of souls. He didn't tend to socialize much. Even Rob barely spent an hour or two a week in his company, and those for whom he worked knew him only as a hired gun brought in to do specific jobs. No one might have realized he was close to madness. He hadn't realized it himself, yet it must be the case. He must be having a breakdown. What else could explain this response to a story told by the owner of a gas station to entertain a passing customer? Again, you think only in terms you've been taught by others, though you have a mind that could have taught itself much. Your Allison understood. She understood that you had the power to shape the world, not merely be tossed by its currents. And you understood it somewhere deep in your weak little heart. But you burned that thought, that possibility out of yourself, and you let her go. And you were left with nothing but ashes. As the speech in his head went on, John thought that it was changing. It was no longer quite exactly his voice. Whatever was speaking to him had initially used his own internal manner to communicate, but as it got warmed up, it was claiming its own character, making his thoughts merely a conduit for its communication. More and more, it was the voice of another person. What other person? Joshua Caesar? That was insane. John had first heard of Joshua Caesar an hour ago. This was a hallucination, its content triggered by McGlynn's story. That was the only explanation. He'd been primed to have a breakdown, clearly. That had probably been why he decided to take his emotionally charged trip to Chicago. That had to be the explanation. But hadn't he started to think of Allison only as the gas station, the tree, the misplaced scarecrow came into his sight as he topped the last hill before this one? Hadn't he become intrigued by the scarecrow, by the tree under which it grew, before he'd heard the story? And why wouldn't his car start? It had been running smoothly, beautifully, all the way from New Jersey, better than some new cars he'd owned. It had run perfectly right up to when he stopped for gas, not the first such stop on his trip. Still, that wasn't unnatural. Things fall apart, as McGlynn had said. That was the second law of thermodynamics. Machines were prone to break, and if they were going to break, they had to do it sometime. Why this time, though? Why now? Why here? You know why. Shut up, John said, with a little more force this time, though he felt the hair rise on the back of his neck at the implications of the three-word sentence. The voice meant for him to believe that his car's breakdown was no accident. It meant for him to think that it, the corpse of Joshua Caesar, who had supposedly sold his soul or his heart to the devil, had made the car freeze, its engine unable to turn over. That was nonsense. Insane or not, John didn't think that even if there was a real mummified human corpse under those cliché scarecrow garments, such a thing could affect the external world. Even if it was the body of the man named Joshua Caesar, that man was dead. That man had been dead for decades. He could do nothing but rot. Then why are you afraid? John wanted to say that he wasn't afraid, but he wasn't able to lie to himself so flagrantly. If he paid attention, he could feel his heart thudding in his chest, could feel goosebumps breaking out on his skin. He decided not to deny the fear, and felt strange pride in that acceptance. Aloud, for reasons he couldn't easily have articulated, he said, "Of course I'm afraid. I'm talking to a voice in my head. I'm going crazy. Why wouldn't I be afraid?" He didn't look inward as he spoke, though. He looked up the hill at the scarecrow. "You think that you're insane? You think you're just talking to yourself?" "Of course," John said, aware that speaking aloud to a voice in his head was strong evidence of the truth of the diagnosis. Somehow it felt less frightening than the alternative. "Then why do you fear me? Why does looking at me cause you disquiet?" The scarecrow's contemptuous expression did not change, but John thought that a trick of the light made its sneer seem deeper. Was the cloud cover still thickening? It couldn't be near sunset yet, could it? If he were losing track of himself enough that hours had passed while he stood beside the gas station, then his mind was more disjointed than he could have imagined. Surely, though, if he'd been hovering next to the building for so long, either Matty or McGlynn, or both, would have come out to see what he was doing. Surely the tow truck would have arrived. Unless, of course, they were all figments of his imagination. Was that possible? Could he have imagined all of it? Could his car be failing to start because he'd run out of gas and had stopped at what turned out to be an abandoned service station? Could he merely have imagined filling up his tank, buying junk food, and listening to McGlynn's story? It seemed ridiculous. That degree of departure from reality surely wouldn't happen so abruptly. No matter what the movies said, people didn't just suddenly go insane like flipping a switch. John was pretty sure of that. It was a progressive process. It was a deterioration. The minor faults in the system would happen before the major glitches appeared, and John thought, he all but knew, that some of them would have reared their heads before now. There is the mind that has such potential. There is the ability to see clearly, which you've constrained with blinders that you placed there yourself. The drive that you held back with weights you chained to your own feet. Cast aside the blinders and the dead weights. Free yourself from your own limitations. Dare to look at me more closely. No way, John thought, this time keeping the words inside his head. The voice was becoming more and more that of another person, and he didn't want to encourage it. It was quiet, but he could hear it all too clearly, above the sound of the waxing and waning breeze and the traffic on the interstate. It was enticing, but at the same time filled him with revulsion. He thought of a documentary he had seen once, with footage of a great cat killing and beginning to devour its prey. He'd been repelled by the violence, the blood, and the death, but at the same time, the strength of the predator had awed him. He felt now that he was in the presence of such a creature, a thing of majesty and beauty, but also of ruthless cruelty. He didn't want to get closer to it, any more than he would want to walk into a cage with a tiger. Yet you say that this is all in your mind. If it is, if it's just, as you might say, a failure of your own programming, then proximity wouldn't matter, would it? You would carry your predator within you no matter where you went. What have you to fear from an out-of-place and out-of-time Halloween decoration? That might be true. That might indeed be true. If he was insane, then he was not going to be able to escape that fact by keeping his distance from a scarecrow. But still, why go closer? Why approach it? What would he be proving to himself? What would he do if he learned that he was not insane? Which would be better, for the voice in his head to be his own fractured mind openly working against itself, or to find that somehow the mind or soul of Joshua Caesar had survived in that ominous figure on the hilltop and was speaking to him in his head, taunting him? The wind rose again, moving the tree, and its branches swayed from side to side. John imagined that the tree was trying to warn him away. He almost thought he heard a woman's voice saying, "Don't listen to him, don't get closer." But this, he knew, was only in his mind. There was no thinking remnant of that older Allison Cheney. He tried to clear his head. This was nonsense. How could he suddenly think such things? He was a computer programmer and engineer. There were rules in the world. It didn't suddenly go off the rails and start making no sense. Unless, of course, as the voice had said, there were rules of which he was simply unaware, but that was ridiculous. Then come closer and face me. Look at me directly and prove to yourself that I'm truly a dead thing. Prove to yourself that I never was alive, that I'm just a set of clothes in a sack stuffed with styrofoam and cotton. Let the evidence speak for itself. Why, John thought. Why would the thing want him to come closer? Assuming it were real, assuming it were somehow Joshua Caesar, why would it want him to come nearer? What purpose could that serve? Because I want to look at you as well. I want to see the face of this man who had the power to seek greatness and didn't use it, and who had a woman who would have been with him on his journey, adding her power to his. I want to see the man who had what I craved and threw it away because of the weakness of his heart. I want you close enough that if I were alive, I could spit on you. Now, for the first time since he had begun to recognize what the voice claimed to be, sullen anger ignited in the supposed ashes of John's heart. He didn't know if the voice was real or imaginary, but that was irrelevant to his ire. Its contempt was intolerable. Who did it think it was passing judgment on him? His character and choices were what they were, and he had made them deliberately and with understanding. His priorities might not be for everyone, but they were right for him. Why should he struggle and strain to accomplish some worldly success, fame, or achievement which, rather than make his life easier, would make it more difficult, more stressful? What would be the point when every person was born to die and there was no evidence that the program of their life would continue after that? It was good to avoid poverty, but beyond that, what was the use of trying to achieve an existence of influence that left you a slave of your own ambition? He'd made his decisions about such things long ago and had not regretted them. Of course, losing Allison had been a blow. Even now, the thought of her brought an ache to his chest, which was why he so assiduously avoided allowing her to the surface of his mind. She was a dangerous presence, a source of pain. Like any creature, he tried to avoid things that hurt. That was precisely why he had chosen not to pursue a life of high achievement, straining to accumulate wealth and prestige. As far as he could see, such pursuits caused their subjects stress, exhaustion, and an uninterrupted stream of pain. Did some of them do great things, even important things? Of course. But given the ephemeral nature of life, did he think those great things were worth the price? Not for himself, he didn't. And what had the pursuit of ambition and power gotten Joshua Caesar, if the story was true? It hadn't won him the love of his life, any more than John had kept his own Allison. Joshua Caesar hadn't had the admiration and respect of his peers, didn't even have the consolation of having done anything of benefit to the world. He had been hated and feared, which may have given him more satisfaction than simply being ignored, but which surely could not be very fulfilling. And then he had been set upon by a mob of his neighbors and had his heart cut out. What had been the benefits of his striving? Was this the payment the devil had promised him? Had he been told that he would be rewarded by being dressed in cheap farmer's clothes, a burlap sack on his head with stitches for eyes and mouth, tied to a cross under a tree next to the interstate? He certainly couldn't be said to be living the dream. He wasn't even dying the dream. If Joshua Caesar was real, then he was an object lesson in the rightness of John's philosophy and the foolishness of making deals with the devil to achieve earthly wealth or power. "You understand nothing," the voice said, with a sound of barely controlled chuckling. "I made no deal with the devil. I simply located the devil in the hearts and souls of all humans who have ever lived, and I saw that this was the source of humanity's true greatness. I saw real beauty and majesty for the first time on the battlefield and was inspired. And with my own injury, my own brush with death, I learned of the power I had within me. Do you think I'm now reaping the rewards of a life badly lived, that I suffer for my sins? You're misled by the lies the weak tell to excuse themselves from responsibility for their own failures. You want to believe that I suffer now, and that I suffered then because I made selfish choices, or ambitious choices, or because I was cruel and evil. But I do not suffer. I feel no pain. I am simply aware when I wish to be, able to feel the minds of the multitudes of the miserable and the weak who drive past every day, wrapped in their metal torture chambers. I know from their minds what's transpired in the world since the time my heart was cut out. I've learned of the rise of technologies that were beyond even the science fiction of my time, and I've seen that these advances, as always, have been the work of but a handful of souls, souls with greatness, souls with power, and that the rest of humanity are insects. Insects that, having landed on the shoulders of a colossus, are carried forward to places they never could have reached on their own, to riches and wonder they could never themselves create or deserve. And until now I've been content to watch, to listen, to learn passively, and to rue the fact that there are so many vermin where there might be lions. But I was personally affronted. How disappointed can one be, after all, by the fact that insects are insects? But when you approached, I felt something in your mind. I felt the potential within you. I felt the power you had, and which you used so sparingly. I wanted to learn more about you. What I learned sickened me more than all the crawling multitudes wallowing in their own waste. You have the power of a titan, but you live as a mite. Your soul is vast, but your heart is weak. I have no heart at all now, but there is more contained in the hollow of my chest than has ever beat in yours. I can excuse those who are weak because they're incapable of strength, but you are weak by choice. You fear the effort, the unpleasantness that would accompany the achievement of your potential, and so you delude yourself with your excuses, and you give up on your dreams, and you burned away what little heart you had. Then I heard the name of the woman that you drove away with your heartlessness, and her name was the name of the girl I had naively chosen to love in my younger days. What cosmic irony was at play here that you, with a potential even greater than mine, had been within reach of a woman I might have dreamed of, while I had chosen to love a woman who was content to be nothing, to live the life of a sheep. What a perfect twist of the knife of fate. You had what I wanted, but you chose to give it up rather than become great, while I had been what you could be, but the dream of love in my heart had been spent on an unworthy object, someone for whom it's appropriate that her only memorial is a mindless piece of vegetation. I couldn't let you go by. I wanted to learn more about this coincidence, this fate, and to understand why you still chose to be weak, even though it had cost you all that mattered to you. So I drew you here. I drew your attention and your curiosity. I encouraged you to ask about me, and I encouraged the telling of my story. There are inaccuracies in the tale you heard, but they're minor. I am all that I was reputed to be, and more. I wanted to see what the name of my Allison Cheney would mean to you, and whether you would have the character to at least regret your choice of weakness. But you don't. You have stifled and burnt your heart, and now it serves you in almost no way. You're pathetic, and I needed to tell you that. John had remained physically and mentally silent during this long diatribe, gaping at the scarecrow as though hearing its words booming from the hilltop, filling the fields below. Though the voice was within his head, more and more John was convinced that it really did come from the figure on the hill. He suddenly realized that his latest cigarette had gone out, even though it hadn't reached the filter. He must have hardly been breathing. He took the butt from his mouth to throw away, realizing as he did that his hands were shaking. Why were they shaking? He examined himself, trying to come to some clear conclusion, because he didn't think they shook only out of fear. He was afraid. He was more afraid than he could recall being, at least of any non-physical threat. The raised hackles on his neck and the goose flesh on his body persisted, and his heart, whatever the voice said, beat powerfully and rapidly in his chest. His throat was dry, and his mouth hung open still. The reasons for fear were obvious. He was listening to a voice inside his head, a voice berating him, telling him how weak he was, and that voice was coming from one of two possible places. The first possibility, the most rational one, ironically, was that it was the voice of another part of his mind, that he was insane. Some part of his psyche was railing against the rest of him with an identity and character of its own. He was crazy. He would end up institutionalized, or at least on medication, for the rest of his life, or he would deteriorate and spiral down into a destitute, homeless state before dying in the gutter. But the other possibility was worse, for it changed his understanding of the very nature of reality, of life and death, of what was possible. It revealed that his knowledge of the workings of the world was superficial, perhaps trivial, and that reality contained possibilities he had never imagined. If a man from western Pennsylvania could return from war with the power to kill those who stood in his way, to build a personal empire, to destroy the source of his own heartbreak, and then, more astounding, to live on within his own crucified corpse, hearing the minds of those who drove by, reaching out and influencing people. If all those things were possible, what was not possible? What horrors might exist in the world that he had never imagined? Surely that was a reason for fear, if ever there had been one. If that was all true, then all of humanity, all of civilization, was just a small band of ragged tribesmen, huddled around the tiny flickers of a campfire, while all around them in the jungle lurked huge and terrible beasts that could seize and consume them at will. If there was one entity such as Joshua Caesar, why would there not be others? That was terrifying. Yet fear was not the only reason for the shaking of John's hand as he cast aside his cigarette butt, this time not worried about littering. He was also angry. "What right do you have to be angry?" the voice said. "You who now glimpse the beginning of the possibilities I represent, that you could represent. See only dread and horror. See the danger of the jungle, not the majesty, the beauty, the opportunity it represents. You're a lion with the heart of a lab rat who fears the world beyond his cage and convinces himself that he's right to consign himself to captivity. You deserved to have your meager heart broken. You deserved to lose your Allison Cheney. You aren't worthy of her. You're all the more unworthy because you could have been more than worthy, and you chose not to be out of cowardice. I say again, I want you close enough that if I had the power, I could spit on you. You disgust me." "Fuck you," John said, loudly this time, only vaguely aware that those within the gas station might hear him. The voice, unimpressed by his ire, said, "Such clever rhetoric. Your debating skills make it clear why you're able to convince yourself of the rightness of your path, even in the face of all evidence. Your acumen is astonishing. I'm clearly outmatched." Despite the taunts, John repeated, "Fuck you," and he took a few steps forward, away from the side of the gas station, toward the far end of the small paved area, toward the field, the hill, the tree, and the body that claimed to be Joshua Caesar. "You don't know shit. You think you're so smart, so strong, but you're the one who's tied to a post under a tree by the highway in the middle of butt-fuck Egypt. No one ever heard of you except the people out here, and they think you're just a campfire story. You're just that guy, that statue in the old poem. Ozymandias, the voice said, and John felt its amused scorn that it had to tell him the reference that he had invoked. He was too angry to care, and he took 2 more steps forward. "Yeah, right, that one," he said. "You're just a statue in the desert, telling everybody how great you were, but everything you did is just dust and sand. All you did was take things and hurt people, and even kill the people you loved, and then got your heart cut out and your stupid body tied to a cross under a tree. Am I supposed to think that you have a better idea about how I should live my life? That's funny. That's hilarious. You're the one who's pathetic." If John thought that he was going to make the voice angry, angrier than it already was, then he was disappointed. In even tones it replied, "I would rather spend 1,000 years tied to this post than live a year of the life you've chosen, subordinating yourself to those you know to be your inferiors, eking out the barest comfortable existence using some small part of the power within you. This cross of wood is indeed my statue in the desert, and it doesn't matter that I'm surrounded by sand. This cross was made by those who hated and feared me, but it's still a form of worship. It shows that they recognize how much greater I was than they, and they knew that at least some of their paltriness was of their own doing. This is indeed my monument, and it's a grand one. I am still aware while those who killed me are withered and gone. But you are worse than any of them. You live in a hell of your own choosing when you could have soared to any heaven you desired. I say it again. I wish that I could spit on you." "Is that right?" John asked, and now he began to stride forward, his anger effacing his remaining fear. "You want to spit on me? Well, why don't you try to do it? You're so great and powerful and all that shit. Why can't you do it? Why can't you even spit on me? You figured it all out. You're so great. Why can't you even spit on me? Because you're nothing but a fucking corpse stuck to a pole under a tree. You're nothing." He didn't think about what he was doing as he walked off the edge of the pavement and onto the overgrown grass that led up the hill. He barely noticed the change from hard surface to squishy springiness beneath his feet. The grass grew taller as he started up the slope, so he had to lift his legs more with each step. That, plus the ascent, made walking a strain, but he didn't notice himself getting winded as he went. His ire was too great. "So let's go then," he added, striding up the incline. He knew that his behavior was irrational. He was stalking up a hill to confront a scarecrow, to yell in its burlap face. It was ridiculous. It would have been infantile, but for the fact that even an infant would know that one can't have an argument with a scarecrow. He was just arguing with himself. He was talking to a voice in his own head. He was, however, past caring about the truth of the matter, about whether he was at odds with himself in a state of new insanity, or whether there really was some mind or power left in the crucified figure that berated him. It didn't matter. He was outraged. He was outraged particularly because the voice said that he deserved for Allison to leave him, that he hadn't been worthy of her. John tried not to have too many illusions in life, but he knew that he was as prone to narcissism as anyone else, though his heart had indeed been broken by Allison's departure, and he thought that hers had been too. He'd consoled himself with the notion that he was simply wiser than she. He saw the nightmare futility of the proverbial rat race, the self-imposed purgatory of the drive to achieve ever greater goals, ever greater wealth. Honor, like money, was ultimately dross. It fell away in the end. But now this voice, which might have been Joshua Caesar or might have come from his own mind, was telling him that he had been the fool all along, that the honors and wealth weren't dross, that there was glory even in being a shattered statue in a desert, that this was greater than living a mediocre life if you had the potential to do otherwise. He was angry because he feared he might have been wrong. He feared that he might have given up the greatest joy, the greatest person in his life due to a choice born of cowardice rather than courage. He was going to show his courage now. He was going to face this phantasm, either within his mind or within the scarecrow, and he was going to show it that fear was not the driving force behind his decisions. He would stand nose to nose with this stuffed effigy and give it a piece of his mind, if it were not already just such a thing. It didn't occur to John as he crossed the halfway point between where he had stood against the side of the building and the hilltop that there might be any danger apart from insanity. He didn't notice that the cloud cover seemed to thicken even more than before, darkening the day nearly to twilight. His own vision was red with rage. He didn't notice that the wind had risen even more, and that in it the great tree's branches swayed and shook as though trying even more vigorously than before to wave him away, to warn him from coming closer. He didn't notice that the noise from the interstate had dimmed and disappeared as though he had stepped slightly outside of its universe. He did notice, though, that the harsher wind pushed the burlap sack tighter again across whatever lay beneath it. He saw that there did indeed seem to be a skull-like face below the material. If it was a fake, it was a superb one. He saw the stitched mouth pull back into a derogatory grin. The damned thing was laughing at him. The slope began to level out as he approached its summit. Though the light had dimmed significantly since the time John had first noticed the scarecrow, he was much closer now, so he could make out its details. He learned little that was new. Its shirt was a classic gray work shirt, such as any serious laborer might wear, and the pants were similar, heavy-duty khakis. The boots were slightly worn leather lace-ups, and the gloves were canvas. All this gear, though clearly having seen use, looked like it might have been purchased within the last year. It could not possibly be 70 years old. The sack on the head looked almost too cliché to be believed, perhaps some old potato sack or feed bag, with a weave tight and thick enough that it couldn't be seen through, and with a seam along the top and one side. He noticed that, as McGlynn had said, someone had gone to the trouble of cutting slits in the bag for the eyes and the mouth before stitching them crudely together with twine. It seemed an absurd waste of effort, first to give the bag holes, then close them off immediately after. It was particularly bizarre since, even if it were a real corpse under that rugged clothing, it certainly had no voice and no vision. Well, it had a voice, or John's mind gave it one, but that voice was not dependent upon its mouth. These thoughts flitted away, brushed aside by John's anger. He expected the voice to taunt him as he approached, either to egg him on or to try to get him to turn back, but it remained silent. He felt again that the figure was looking slightly more in his direction than before, but this was likely the result of his own walk up the hill. Though he had made what he thought was a beeline for the cross and its occupant, the slope had no doubt altered his course, changing his angle of approach. Panting slightly, John drew close to the scarecrow, stopping about 5 feet in front of it. If it had fallen off its post at that moment, its head might have landed on his shoes. "Well," he said, "still want to spit on me?" The voice said nothing, and the wind-pulled mask regarded him with mocking amusement. "What's the matter?" John said. "Nothing but talk? And you even have to do that in my head. Why don't you spit in my face?" The voice remained silent, while behind it the tree whipped in a minor frenzy of wind that seemed not even to touch John, though he should have felt its force on the back of his head. A tiny bit of his mind noticed this disquieting fact, but his anger was too great to give ground. "Come on," he said. "Here, I'll pull your fucking bag up for you. See if there's anything left that can spit on me. Then it'll be my turn." He took a few steps closer until he was all but nose to nose with the figure, the head of the scarecrow barely an inch higher than his own. He planned to lift the bag, which he could now see was bound tightly around the figure's neck with loops of twine such as had stitched the eyes closed. He wasn't sure how he would go about it, but he intended to try. Even as he reached out to test the bonds, however, the head, which had faced slightly to the right, allowing it to seem to watch John's approach, turned to look directly at him. John gasped. This was no trick of parallax, no change of angle, no unrecognized alteration in its path. He had just seen the thing move to face him. It was a shift of only a few degrees, but it was unmistakable. He heard the burlap sack rustle against the work shirt and against the presumed neck beneath. It didn't occur to him to back up, nor to be even more frightened, but he was dumbfounded and lost all thought of trying to take the sack off the thing's head. His hand froze, a few inches in front of his body. How was it possible? Was some living person hidden in these clothes, patiently waiting for McGlynn to tell his story and for John to begin to believe it? Was this some outrageous practical joke? John immediately dismissed the possibility. Not only was it unworkable, and his own presence too unpredictable to prepare for, it was also simply a fact that the voice in his head could not have been produced by pranksters. It was either something inside him or something truly outside. Not merely outside of his head, but outside of the world as he had ever known it, something alien. And now that something had turned its head. John hadn't bothered to note how the arms had been tied to the crosspiece. He'd been focused more on the face. Now, out of the corner of his eye, he recognized that they had been tied to the post by old-fashioned hemp rope. He noticed it because the rope chose that moment to rot and fall away, freeing the arm, which did not flop down limply, but flexed forward at the elbow, perhaps stretching out the kinks of long disuse. Then John's attention returned to the head, as he heard the voice in his mind, and he thought the slightest whisper of a real voice, a graveyard shudder from the entwined throat in front of him, say, "You truly are a fool." Then the slit mouth of the bag curved upward into a smile that could not have been produced by the wind. The eyes opened. Matty was distracted from idly browsing a fishing magazine by the sound of a car motor roaring to life. He squinched his eyebrows and looked up. Had someone arrived at the gas station when he wasn't paying attention, realized they couldn't pay for their gas at the pump, and decided to drive on rather than come inside? He didn't think so. If they had, he should have heard them pull up. He gazed through the grimy plexiglass window of the gas station door and was surprised to see the Mustang, which had been driven by the man who'd come in and heard Mr. McGlynn's story, start to move forward. His mouth opened a bit. Hadn't that car been broken down? The man and Mr. McGlynn had both gone out and checked it to see if they could get it running. Matty had watched them from the doorway. They'd tried many things, but the car hadn't even begun to catch. Now the Mustang drew away from the pumps, and Matty knew that it had been the car he'd heard roar to life. He walked around the corner and toward the door. As he did, he saw that Mr. McGlynn had come out of the back room, a puzzled frown on his face. McGlynn exchanged a glance with Matty, nodded as if to give him permission, and the two walked through the door of the station. As they stepped outside into the overcast afternoon, the Mustang pulled onto the main road, rolling along gracefully. Mr. McGlynn stood with his hands on his hips as the car turned into the on-ramp of the interstate, moving to join the traffic heading west. "Well, what the hell?" McGlynn muttered. Matty turned to look at him. After a moment he said, "I guess he got his car started." McGlynn shook his head ever so slightly, more in apparent puzzlement than in negation. "I guess so," he said. "But how? I thought we tried everything that didn't need tools." He turned to look at Matty. "Did you see him looking under the hood?" "No," Matty said with a shake of his own head, "but I wasn't really looking." McGlynn's puzzled expression took on just the slightest cast of irritation as he took 2 steps toward the island where the pump stood. "Well, I guess it's good that he got it going," he said. "It would have been nice of him to let us know before he left." Matty, who had been surprised by the abrupt departure for precisely that reason, said, "Yeah, I would have thought he'd have done that. He seemed like a nice guy." McGlynn nodded, this time plainly in agreement. He moved a bit further, apparently to give himself a better view down the interstate, though Matty thought the car had to be out of sight by now, and said, "Well, I hope he thought to call the garage to let them know he wouldn't need the tow truck." Matty, to whom that bit of housekeeping hadn't occurred, nodded. McGlynn, glancing around idly, stopped when his gaze fell on the pavement near where the Mustang had been parked. "The hell is that?" Matty, surprised to hear the tone of his boss's voice, took a few steps forward, looking down to see what had drawn the reaction. "What's what?" he asked. "That," McGlynn said, pointing down. "Did he put power steering fluid or something in the car while he was out here?" Despite the fact that he worked at a gas station, Matty had never had much to do with automotive maintenance, so he wasn't sure what power steering fluid might be. He followed the direction of his boss's pointing finger and saw a few drops of liquid on the ground. The pavement was light enough to show that the liquid was red. "I don't know," he said. "I guess he must have." He didn't honestly know if that was true, but he didn't want to sound completely ignorant. "Well, why the hell would he do that?" McGlynn asked. "It wouldn't have helped his car start. Although, I guess it did start." He brought his head up to look west along the interstate again, his puzzled frown deeper than before. Matty, still trying to look at least mildly knowledgeable, also looked up from the pavement, swinging his head and eyes around to look at the highway, though what he might see was a mystery to him. As his gaze swept along, some part of his mind caught an incongruity, and he did a mild double-take. His eyes fell on the hill, and on the tree, and most particularly on the shape next to the tree. There was something wrong with it. Matty was so used to seeing that tree and the scarecrow beneath it that he almost didn't credit the fact that anything was different. When he finally recognized what had caught his attention, a chill ran down his spine. "Mr. McGlynn," he said, "look at that." McGlynn, who was glaring at the interstate in mild indignation, asked, "What?" Matty didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what might have been the right words, but just pointed. McGlynn took his turn and followed the direction of Matty's pointing arm, and Matty heard him mutter, "Huh?" as his eyes rested on what had drawn Matty's attention. The tree was just as it usually was. The wind had gone still for the moment, and its branches drooped a bit, looking mournful. Below and to the right of the tree was the post and crosspiece that held up the scarecrow. Someone who didn't know better might have thought it was a religious symbol that had been planted in the top of the hill, perhaps a makeshift grave marker. They would have had no reason to think of a scarecrow. The scarecrow was gone. Though the distance made him unsure, Matty thought he could see the tattered remnants of the rope that had held the scarecrow's arms and legs in place, but the thing itself was not there. Muttering beside Matty, McGlynn said, "What did he do? Yank the stupid thing down? Why would he do that?" Matty, whose mind tended toward more fantastical thoughts, and who started to look around to see if the scarecrow now stood some place other than its usual perch, perhaps stalking closer, preparing to pounce, did not understand his employer's inquiry. "What do you mean?" he said. McGlynn waved an arm toward the hilltop and replied, "It looks like he just threw it on the ground there." Looking more closely, Matty realized that McGlynn was right. There on the hilltop, partly hidden by the tall grass, dark in the early afternoon, lay a limp form that was surely the scarecrow. Matty breathed a sigh of relief, since now he didn't have to worry about being ambushed by a supernatural entity. He was startled when McGlynn began to walk in the direction of the tree and the cross and the shape lying nearby. "Where are you going, Mr. McGlynn?" he asked. Not looking back, but strolling at a modest pace, McGlynn said, "I'm going to see if I can't put the thing back up. It's been there as long as I can remember. Don't know why that punk decided to do something like that. He didn't strike me as a vandal, but I guess..." His voice trailed off, and he came to a halt, looking down again. Matty, still standing near the pumps, asked, "What's wrong, Mr. McGlynn?" when the silence lasted for an uncomfortable interval. McGlynn looked over his shoulder. "Come here a minute," he said, waving his right arm in a summoning gesture. Matty didn't want to go. Quite apart from the fact that the hill and the scarecrow had always spooked him, and that the scarecrow was now out of place, he didn't like the look on his boss's face. Mr. McGlynn had lost his expression of puzzled irritation. Now he seemed troubled. He almost seemed afraid. Still, he was the boss, and a pretty good one at that, so Matty went hesitantly forward. As he drew closer, his eyes followed McGlynn's gaze, and he saw another streak of the red liquid. It was slightly larger than the other splash, and had a longer, thinner shape. Coming to a stop and squinting in puzzlement, Matty asked, "Why would he have power steering fluid over here? His car was over there." He thumbed a gesture toward the pumps, feeling that he sounded at least a little intelligent in his recognition that no one would need a car-related fluid anywhere but near a car. He was quite sure that the Mustang had never moved from in front of the pumps until it had driven away. McGlynn, however, shook his head, not unkindly, and said, "I don't think it's power steering fluid after all." He looked up from the pavement and toward the hilltop again. Matty, not looking up with him, instead crouched down, asking, "And what do you think it is?" He reached out a hand, planning to put a finger in one of the larger of the splashed puddles, which were only a few inches wide in total and several inches long. McGlynn caught sight of his action and quickly called out, "Don't touch that!" Matty pulled his hand back and looked up at his boss, surprised by the urgency of the command. "Why not?" he asked. "What's wrong?" McGlynn looked mildly embarrassed, but he said, "I don't want you to catch anything. It's fresh, isn't it? And they say you can catch things like AIDS and hepatitis from another person's blood." That last word made Matty's own blood run cold as the scales suddenly fell from his eyes and he realized that he was not looking at any sort of automotive fluid. He gasped and rose again to his feet. He wanted to ask a dozen questions but could not formulate any of them. McGlynn, having seen that Matty was following his command, turned and began to walk, perhaps somewhat more hesitantly, toward the hill. Matty, unable to resist looking up at the tree and the empty cross and the discarded heap nearby, found his voice turning high and squeaky as he said, "Mr. McGlynn, what are you doing?" McGlynn shrugged as he walked and without looking back said, Gotta try to see what really happened. After a pause, he added, Something bad, I think. Matty felt that was a spectacular understatement, and he said, Then shouldn't you stay away from whatever happened? McGlynn shrugged again and replied, I think it's better to know. He continued to walk, not too quickly, and had already stepped on the grass when he added, You can stay there if you want. Matty considered it. He looked around and saw no other person moving, unless one counted the traffic on the interstate. When he looked back up the hill, though, it occurred to him that there was one figure on the ground, the empty cross, the tree, and Mr. McGlynn, and himself, of course, but one person was missing. The logical part of his brain told him that, of course, that person had driven off in the car. It had been the pleasant man who'd stopped in and listened to Mr. McGlynn's story. But what if that wasn't what really had happened? What if someone else had made off with the Mustang? What if that person, or something worse, was still lurking in the area? He looked down at the longish, thin splash of red liquid on the pale pavement, and he started to walk forward, quickly enough to catch up with his employer. He didn't know what good it would do, but there was safety in numbers, they said. Even if something or someone attacked, it would be unlikely to be able to get both him and Mr. McGlynn at the same time. Matty wondered if some horrific thing took hold of Mr. McGlynn, whether he himself would try to fight it or if he would try to run. He hoped he didn't have to find out, because either choice was terrible. By the time he caught up to his employer, they were well up the slope, and McGlynn had slowed further out of necessity. He was a big man who didn't get a lot of exercise. Matty tried not to look down at the light splashes of red fluid marring the green of the grass here and there. There weren't floods of the stuff by any means, but there seemed to be a lot, more than there had been on the concrete. The two were almost side by side, Matty a single deferential step behind McGlynn as they crested the top of the hill and got a clear view of the area under the tree. They stopped. The cross was indeed deserted, and the ropes that had held the scarecrow in place hung in loose tatters, looking as though they had not been in condition to hold anything for many years. Directly in front of the wooden cross, a few yards away, lay the prone figure of the scarecrow. From the way it lay, it might have stood facing the cross and then fallen over backward. Was it really a scarecrow, though? Matty didn't think it looked quite right. The clothes were right, of course. The faded work shirt, the tan pants, the gloves and boots were all the same. The burlap sack was also the same, but there were things wrong with it. The twine that had closed the eye slits and mouth slit. Matty had gotten close enough to the scarecrow on one occasion to know that they really had been slits. Had gone the way of the rope on the cross, looking as rotten as natural twine ought to look that had stood outside for 70 years. But it had never looked rotten before. Similarly, the twine that had cinched the bag around the figure's neck had also all but disintegrated, and the bag, likewise decaying, hung sloppily around the thing's head. Also, of course, there was the blood. The ground in front of the cross was splashed with the red liquid, much more than Matty and McGlynn had encountered before, though not the bucketsful Matty might have expected based on horror film viewing. It was plenty, though, more than he'd ever wanted to see. And it was not merely on the ground. The most noteworthy collection of it marred the scarecrow's shirt and pants, starting just below the middle of the chest, spreading out like a waterfall, mostly to the front, but with some having trickled to the sides, as though it had still been flowing when the figure had fallen back. "Oh, my Lord," Matty whispered. McGlynn said nothing, but took a slow and hesitant step forward. Matty felt chagrined to do so, but he shot out a hand and grabbed Mr. McGlynn's shirt sleeve, pulling him to a brief halt, and he said, "Mr. McGlynn, you shouldn't get any closer. That scarecrow's... It's not right. There's something wrong with it. I know it's just a story, but maybe that Joshua Caesar really did sell his soul to the devil and..." "That's not Joshua Caesar," McGlynn interrupted, his voice carrying such conviction that Matty was brought up short. "Look," McGlynn said, pointing toward the figure's head. "You see where the eye slits and mouth slits are open a bit? That's not a 70-year-old corpse." After a pause, he added, "It's a lot fresher than that." Matty looked in the indicated direction. Even in the dim, cloud-covered afternoon, there was enough light for him to see that the modicum of revealed flesh behind the formerly twined eye and mouth holes was, well, not exactly healthy-looking, but certainly firm and unspoiled. He released Mr. McGlynn's shirt. McGlynn walked forward and to the side. Being careful to avoid touching anything with blood on it, he gingerly took hold of the lower end of the burlap bag mask and lifted it. It pulled away easily, the bag having always been quite a bit larger than needed to cover a human head. Matty gasped as he saw the face beneath. It was the traveler, the man who had driven up in the Mustang, filled its tank, bought his snacks, and listened to Mr. McGlynn's story before finding that his car wouldn't start. He'd gone out to smoke a cigarette. Matty had advised him to do so on the far side of the gas station, but maybe he hadn't. Or maybe it hadn't mattered. "Holy shit," he said quietly, though he usually tried to keep from swearing around his employer. "Yeah," McGlynn said. He gazed at the face, as did Matty. The eyes were open and staring forward. The expression was not so much of pain, though that was present, nor even of fear, but mainly of utter shock. Whatever had happened to the man, it had happened quickly. Someone had killed him, it seemed, and had put him in the Scarecrow's clothes and driven off in his car. Why would someone do that? Why would they put him in the Scarecrow's clothes? Mr. McGlynn dropped the sack, obscuring the man's face, and rose to his feet again. As he did, Matty said, "Mr. McGlynn, we need to get away from here. Whatever did this, it might still be around." McGlynn appeared to ignore the warning, and he surprised Matty by reaching out with his right foot and nudging at the front of the supine figure's work shirt. The shirt was untucked, and it was quite a bit too large for its wearer, so McGlynn was easily able to push it up. Apparently he wasn't as worried about getting blood on his shoe as he was his hands, because there was plenty of blood where his foot was touching. The shirt lifted, and Matty felt a wave of horror and nausea as he saw the source of the blood. Something had punctured the man's body, just below the ribs, below the breastbone, at an upward angle. This had clearly been what had killed him. Matty wanted to turn away, but couldn't. The light didn't allow him to see beyond the surface of the wound, but he had little doubt about the nature of the injury, given the story he had heard and what he knew of the legend of the Scarecrow on the hill. He couldn't bring himself to think it, but he knew what had happened, on some level at least. He knew how the man had been killed. McGlynn, using his leg to bring the shirt back over the wound again, turned and looked at Matty, finally answering his comment. "Don't worry," he said, though he sounded far from reassuring. "I don't think whatever did this is still around. It got what it wanted, and then it drove off in the poor bastard's car." It drove off? You mean that—" McGlynn nodded, and Matty did not choose to finish his thought aloud. He looked at the body on the ground, then at the empty cross, then the tree, then back to McGlynn. "What should we do, Mr. McGlynn?" With a sigh, McGlynn said, "Well, I guess the first thing we should do is call the police." He turned and strode away from the hilltop, going much more quickly than he had when approaching it. Matty followed, his own greater speed not merely because of the downhill slope. McGlynn continued, "I don't know what the hell we're going to tell them, or what the hell they're going to think, but we've got to call them. A man's been murdered, and we've got to call the police." They were already coming near the level ground when he added, "I guess we should call Easy Service and tell them they don't need to send their tow truck." As the two reached the pavement, skirting wide of the now small-seeming splash of blood near its border with the grass, Matty asked, "But how could that happen? How could it drive?" He glanced over his shoulder even as he avoided saying the word Scarecrow, half expecting to find it playfully stalking behind him, either the original or the animated corpse of the traveler. "I don't know," McGlynn said, "and I don't want to know. All I can say is I hope it got everything it wanted, and it's done with these parts and is making its way west to some other purpose. I hope it's done with this part of the world for good." They had drawn close to the building, and now McGlynn stopped and looked along the interstate again, adding, "But I doubt it." The two walked into the gas station, leaving the still darkening afternoon behind them.